Amber considered herself as much a part of these places as the dry air that smelled of wormwood, or the huge stones that broke through from the walls of an ancient fortress. Where else? On these stones. She'd been born here, true, not really, but closer to the sea. But their family had moved to this small town when Amber had just started walking. And in 18 years, the girl had become flesh of his flesh. It was a purely female family. No, of course, her grandmother had once had a husband, but Amber no longer remembered her grandfather. He had died long ago, before she was born. She had a father, too. And he was the one she remembered, and she loved him very much. But he couldn't find a job that would allow his family to live in relative poverty. So he took a job as a shift worker, flying across the country every month, far beyond the Rocky Mountains. Mom began patching holes after years of being broke. The family needed everything from new bedding to replace dilapidated ones to coats and boots for growing Amber. Dad loved the West. He told stories of bright summer nights casting tin, of funny coyotes, of moss falling underfoot in the swamps when he went huckleberry picking. But Dad had not only found his place in life, he'd also found a soulmate, someone named Lauren, who worked for him as a cook. He never came back with Lauren. Lauren had her own apartment in Sacramento, and out west, they were given a room in a dormitory for shift workers. Her father continued to send money for Amber, probably most of his Western earnings. Amber didn't want to touch them. Some call it adolescent maximalism, others call it the kind of mental purity that only comes from youth. Amber demanded the transfers be sent back. She didn't want to be tied to this man from the moment he cheated until the end of her days. The blow was stronger, for she was very attached to her father. The only daughter, used to thinking she was the most favorite. Her mother was lost, looking from Amber to her grandmother for guidance. If Amber wanted to mentally picture her mom, the first thing that came to mind was her always scared and unsure look. "You don't want the money, don't take it. You're right," Grandma said calmly, and made a sign to her daughter. "Temmie, leave her alone." "I know it's going to be hard on Mom." Amber knew what her family was thinking. "I'm going to work. There are different ways to live." "Better, worse," Grandma said. "We'll adjust. But remember about Mom, she has poor health." When the women were alone, Grandma told her daughter, "Make an account in Amber's name and put the money in that account. We'll get by somehow. The girl's conscience will be clear. If she wants to someday, and will return to his father every penny, and you can safely look into the eyes of John." Sometimes husbands tell their ex-wives they're living off their alimony. And if, God forbid, I die, that money will come in handy for Amber when she's an adult. Amber didn't know about the second part of the plan and stoically accepted the fact that their little family had the bare necessities. Her mom worked at the library, and she loved books so much that she sometimes brought them back from the dumpster. That was a trend lately. People threw away books, sometimes their own, sometimes inherited from the older generation. After all, anything could be found on the internet. Why clutter up the house with dusty tomes? Mom brought books in dirty bags, or just holding them to her chest. Their own library had grown so large that some of it had moved into the guest house in the garden. But the library paid pennies, and my mother wrote term papers and theses for students in the evenings. Behind each work was a specific goal. Things were bought the cheapest, and still ahead loomed a long list of things that could not do without, and every item on that list was a mom's sleepless night. Amber was used to not asking for anything for herself, not even a refill at the table. Too often lunch was cooked for 2 or 3 days. But the girl early had to think about how to adapt her hands and head to some business. At first, Amber helped her grandmother, twiddling her thumbs. If you compare the family to a ship that sails on the sea called everyday life, then Mom could not be called the captain. She wouldn't rise above a diligent sailor. And when my father left, Grandma took the bridge, and Amber became her right hand. Whether it was standing at the stove, peeling apricots, ironing curtains, Amber uncomplainingly learned and did everything, though her nature asked for something else, and she was not a diligent learner. Even when her father lived at home, Amber realized happiness it is when after an early breakfast, snapped out of the house, all the paths are yours, and with the sky you can be alone. And there is so much strength inside you that you perceive as an unfortunate misunderstanding the impossibility to spread your arms and fly to be swayed by warm winds. It was from her father that she got her love of vagabonding. And he also taught his daughter that when you can, all day long you are satisfied with a piece of bread taken from home. As long as it was sprinkled with salt when you memorize the roads so that you will never get lost and come back, wherever you have wandered. When you don't pay attention to fatigue, to pains in your legs, and you can walk as long as it takes, if it's worth it. And it was worth it. Amber wasn't looking for beautiful, picture-perfect views like the others. She wasn't taking selfies. She wasn't seeking out some of the youth's favorite pastimes. At first, there was simply not enough money for that, and then the girl began to feel like a white crow among her peers and did not even try to become her own in the pack. She simply did not know and could not discuss what they knew and loved. And what touched her, frightened her, amazed or delighted her, left them completely indifferent. I know what you want to be, Valerie, a classmate who sat at the same desk with Amber and with whom Amber had a more trusting relationship than with the other kids, once told her. You want to drive field trips. This happened after the teacher assigned them to write a trivial essay about the love of their homeland. Amber was choking on the topic. There was so much to tell. She was steeped in legends as much as her hair was steeped in sea air. She wanted to talk about everything, and about her favorite gorge, near which a robber had once kidnapped a girl, and she, not resigned to her fate, became a mermaid, and about the valley, where long shadows from the rocks of bizarre, sinister figures come to life in the last hour before sunset. The rocks are motionless, and the shadows fluctuate, reaching out to each other, as if talking, gesturing without words, and about the stone, which fulfills wishes, but charges a terrible price for it. It was impossible not to mention. I read it. The teacher said to her the next day, "Tell us, I want the boys to hear it too. Tell it in your own words, maybe add something else." And instead of English class that day, the class listened to Amber. Among the children were those who went abroad with their parents every summer, or even Christmas vacation. But now they were enthusiastically questioning the girl. Where is that? Have you been there yourself? And how to get there? Do wishes really come true? That's when Valerie dropped out, tucking her textbooks into her bag. You're probably going to be a tour guide, Amber. You're a genius. When she was still in high school, she got a job at a museum complex. There were tons of them. They hired her as a curator. That meant serve, take, get out for herself, for that guy, and for the cleaning lady. And then she started leading tours. First in the low season, when it's not too crowded. Then with other, already experienced women. And now she had her own page on the internet, and on the author's excursions, which offered Amber, signed up in line. She bought a car, the loan for which she had to pay off until the second coming. And she took people to places the guides rarely went, unless they were desperate amateurs. Mostly her clients were families or young couples who were no strangers to romance. And many, many people asked enthusiastically at the end of the tour, "Don't you take them to the fortress?" Amber never took anyone to the fortress, although for a long time it was a very popular route. Until someone upstairs decided that it could be dangerous for tourists. Stones crumble, and sometimes whole blocks collapse from the fortress walls. Cave vaults collapse. It would be good to reconstruct, but there was no money for reconstruction, of course. And the excursions became illegal. They were offered as part of other routes in the vicinity. The guide tempted, "Let's pay a little more per nose and go to the most extraordinary place we have in our neighborhood." But Amber never took anyone to the fortress. It was her sanctuary. Jerry realized he had been cruelly played. He was barely alive, you might say, after a worsening ulcer. When he'd been seized that night, none of the household had thought it was that serious, or, one might even say, that bad. But Lisa did not want to long to look at the suffering of her husband. Jerry was lying in the fetal position, afraid to move, so as not to become more painful, and called an ambulance. Everyone thought that the matter would be limited to drips and hospitalization for a week. At the very least, surgery. But Jerry wasn't getting any better. The tests didn't seem to show anything critical. But the surgeon took him to the table, rather guided by intuition, which has and will continue to help real doctors. And in the process it was discovered that from the smart devices, it turns out, something can escape. And it was hard to take Jerry away from death. He came hard from anesthesia, and for several days even the strongest drugs did not significantly alleviate his suffering. The head nurse was particularly warm to him. She was the one who came up with the idea of letting Jerry sleep at all costs, because sleep is health. She persuaded the doctor to add sleeping pills to the prescribed medication. It probably wouldn't have had much effect on anyone else, but for Jerry it worked wonders. The pain was greatly reduced. He felt in himself that fracture, after which began, though slow, long, but still the way to recovery. And then his many friends came up with the idea to play his wife, which they could not stand too much. Lisa was in love with herself. And what's worse, after getting married, Jerry, who before that knew every dog in town, began to behave much more withdrawn. Now Lisa was deciding where they would go and whether they would go at all, who to invite to visit and in front of whom to close the door, and so on. When Lisa complained to her husband that she cannot tolerate women, so she does not get along in any team, for her coquetry, felt that they do not like me, because I am prettier than them, and because you carry me in your arms. But there were enough men on whom Lisa not only did not make any impression, she annoyed them. Too much manners, fixated on themselves, accustomed to being served. Lisa usually visited her husband after visiting hours were over. She and Jerry had a goodwill at the hospital, and once again Lisa was demonstrating that she was different. She didn't fill her bag with cans of hot food, she brought only fruit and water, sitting by her husband's bedside like a graceful butterfly. As she thought herself, a viper, as others thought. The prank the Powells had planned turned out to be cruel not only to Lisa, but to Jerry himself. But when they had conceived it, it had seemed so successful that the friends, as they say, had balked at the consequences. Without difficulty, they found a smashing girlfriend of one of them who agreed to play the part. They asked the same head nurse for a white coat on some pretext. One of the friends was on duty in the corridor, waiting for Lisa to arrive to give the signal. Jerry was asleep in his room. He had gotten his sleep in his sleeping pills early today, and Lisa, entering the room, caught a wild picture. The nurse was wearing almost nothing, only a conventional white robe on her shoulders. She was sitting in front of her husband, in a pose that the young woman found the most obscene of all possible, legs spread, showing off her charms. The nurse was holding a plate of omelets, scooping them into a spoon and clearly about to feed Jerry. The friends knew Lisa's character well enough to calculate how she would behave. The woman didn't squeal, didn't throw a tantrum. She simply dropped her bag and stormed out of the room. A few minutes later, one of the buddies came out, smiling. The scene gave him pleasure. Let her feel for once not like a queen, but take the place she deserves, a bitch in her own right. Lisa hadn't shown up at the hospital since. When Jerry called, she hung up, and when he was discharged, he had to move back in with his parents. He hoped temporarily. Sooner or later, he and Lisa would reconcile. She didn't even notice I was asleep, Jerry lamented. They'd chosen a pose so she couldn't see my face. Except that sister's a stripper, for crying out loud. I had no idea what the bastards were up to. I call them up, and they're laughing their asses off. You should thank us for saving you from that snake. At least we gave you a break. It'll kill you. Jason listened to Jerry's wailing and went about his business. Maybe that's why Jerry came to him. He knew he'd be listened to, but not ridiculed, judged, or bombarded with advice. Jason lived a hermit's life. If it could be said of a man who didn't live in a cave or a hut, whose apartment was on the top floor of a 5-story building, a 2-bedroom in a Khrushchevka on the edge of a big city, and then the private sector began. From the balcony you could see the river. There was a bus ring curled up near the house. There was a mini market and a few stores. Jason would come down here to get groceries, and when he decided to buy what he needed, he'd go back upstairs almost immediately. But sometimes he'd still take a walk to the river. The old houses had long ago pushed the 2- and 3-story mansions away from the embankment, and there was only one way to get to the shore, past the high fences that kept out the elite from the nobility. Jason walked without realizing he was walking like a prisoner with his hands behind his back, standing by the water for long periods of time. Even if it was windy and damp, the Mississippi was cold just to look at. Sometimes he took a different route and went up into the mountains. It was a short walk to them, just a couple of streets, and here he was at the foot of one of them. And a paved road serpentine led to the top. It was used to take children to the camp every day. There was a mast on the mountain. There was also a radio and television station. The serpentine lengthened the way a little, but it was not worth going straight ahead. There were vipers on the slopes when it was warm, and he had to be careful not to step on one. None of Jason's friends lived like him. They considered him a crank, but agreed that perhaps his profession required it. Jason wrote books. Those who had known him for years said that he had been different before, a romantic with a wanderlust, an athlete who had achieved a lot. A man who was open-minded, even overly so. And Jason had met his Emily on one of his camping trips. Both of them were the kind of reckless people that old songs talk about. The old compass is calibrated, the maps and edges are obtained, and to you, to storms like avalanches, the treacherous trail, happy to whom the pinching feeling of the road is familiar, but where the wind tears horizons and blows the dawn. Jason brought the girl to his town right after that hike, straight from the Appalachians. They'd rented a room, then inherited the apartment, which Jason had never changed since. And for the few years he and Emily lived here, their house was open to everyone. There wasn't an evening when friends didn't gather, and even the neighbors would come over to listen to guitar songs and say, "You guys don't need a TV." Jason was writing his second book at the time. The first was well received, and it gave him confidence that the path is chosen correctly. You just need to go and go on it, every day marking the right number of steps. Well, that is lines. Jason went to the sea to finish the novel, and Emily, of course, went with him. It was already low season, and prices were down, so it was hoped that it would be possible to live by the sea for a few months. Money was still tight. But in late October, Jason returned home to bury Emily. The young woman's death had been a tragic accident, but even among her closest friends, no one knew anything for sure. It seemed that Emily had crashed after falling from a height, either during an excursion or during an outing with her husband in the mountains, or maybe on the rocks. It was believable. The boys were not particularly careful, and they'd had all sorts of adventurous adventures before. Emily was buried in a closed casket. Jason hadn't notified anyone about the funeral. Whoever found out by chance showed up, and it was immediately apparent that Jason had changed dramatically. He was silent, as if he had water in his mouth, hardly answering questions, ignoring condolences, and apparently wanting to be left alone. Well, grief affects everyone differently. Some people go to people to cry on someone else's shoulder, and some people don't want to expose the bleeding wound in their soul. Eventually, they got rid of Jason, gave him a chance to live the life he now wanted, and he craved privacy. From then on, he spent most of his time in the apartment, allowing himself nothing but occasional walks. But he still wrote books. True, they had changed. If before they were novels, twisted plot, where the adventures of the heroes did not give the reader an extra breath, then now Jason apparently was not capable of such a thing. Once he was fond of biathlon, took places in competitions, and now wrote stories about sports in the style of realism, with knowledge, but not so exciting anymore. Before he had a rifle for biathlon and excellent skis. When he gave up sports, he sold it all, but later he bought a gun again, an expensive hunting rifle. Now it hung over his bed at home. It was probably the most valuable thing in the house. "What do you need it for?" John asked him one day. He went to his friend's house more often than anyone else. Jason hadn't completely closed the door on his old friends, and everyone knew they could come to him and ask to stay for a few days. For example, if there was a family quarrel. And now John was practically living at his place. You don't go hunting anyway. You say you can't kill anyone. Jason looked at his friend without a smile. Maybe I'm just saying that. Or was it before? John was confused. He didn't know whether to take it as a joke or as. There was something about Jason's look that. Until now, he'd been sure that his friend was incapable of raising a hand against anyone. Now all he had to do was break the awkward pause and turn the conversation to something else. Well, that was easy. "How am I supposed to make up with Lisa?" John asked wistfully. "She not only does not want to talk to me on the phone, but also does not let me home." It was clear to everyone Lisa wants to be begged for forgiveness. But in her heart, she's also afraid that John won't have the patience. She's walking the line. In her version, John should demonstrate such a degree of remorse and beg for forgiveness in such ways that it becomes legendary among mutual acquaintances. But there's another option. John could give up and find someone else. Then Lisa, too, will have to start her life from scratch. And there's nothing worse for her. "I don't understand," Jason said. "What are you worried about? Is Lisa alive? That's the most important thing. And the rest." And he waved his hand. So John stopped talking and couldn't say anything else. Amber had a piece of jewelry in her left ear, an earring. For some reason, a single, small ruby drop. It had been threaded in her lobe for as long as Amber could remember. The earring was discreet, and Amber hardly ever thought about it, except once, when she decided at 13 to really pierce both ears and put earrings in. Girls that age have a tendency to want nothing more than earrings in their ears at a certain point in their lives. "Okay, let's go to the beautician." Mom agreed when Amber couldn't resist telling her what she wanted. "And for your birthday, I'll give you earrings gold. Of course I cannot, but silver." "I'll take this one off." Amber picked up a red droplet with her fingernail. She'd lost her pair anyway, unlike a pirate, wearing it in one ear. No, Mom and Grandma exclaimed at the same time. Why? Is there something I don't know? Is this some kind of family legend? Do you cherish Sergei as a memory? Amber looked from one woman to another, and she could feel her loved ones hesitating to tell her anything. Just put it on and consider it a fairy tale, her grandmother added. Amber's eyes lit up. Scary tales were her favorite thing in the world. She'd read them all at the children's library, and she loved the ones with the lions, mermaids, and sorcerers more than the funny stories about girls and bunnies. When you read such things, at night you dare to go out of your room to the toilet, only if you light up the light in the whole apartment. And if some mysticism lives in their family's history, how did their loved ones hope to keep anything from her? Inga's mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone was going to let it slip, it would be her. But Antonina only averted her eyes. Yes, Grandma had begged. Let's hope that everyone has already forgotten everything, said Inga's grandmother. Does this thing bother you? No. Then forget about it. And remember that you don't need to know everything. But it's my ear. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mom sighed. She caught her grandmother's glance, stopped talking half a word, and as if cut off. No matter how much Inga pestered her, her mother never said a word on the subject. And only much later, having resorted to the unworthy technique of eavesdropping, Inga at least roughly understood what the matter was. Mother often came to her grandmother's house to sit up before going to bed. No matter how tired she was, but to talk, to discuss what had happened during the day, to complain about something, to ask for advice, it was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit down next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the fragments of these whispers that Inga learned the story. Once in that old fortress on the mountain lived the rulers of the area. Imagine that. Where now only the wind walks through empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, not even ruins, and all the stones have been scattered. There used to be life. And thousands of people walk daily along the roads paved with stones. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress. Blank walls, windows only in the courtyard. Was the largest and stood on the edge of the cliff, and inside. It was known, but no one could tell you about it in detail. There were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who had angered the master, or prisoners whom he hoped to exchange for a favorable exchange, were imprisoned here for 20 years. As the years passed, the fortress ceased to play its role. There was no need for people to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer and fewer inhabitants. It was a kind of a test to climb the mountains every day, to live near the sky, but to save water for everything else, to go down to the valley for every little thing. There remained old people and those who are faithful to tradition, who want to die close to their native hearth and be buried in the old cemetery next to their loved ones. There came a time when the master's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something among them. There was something about the old lords. All members of the clan continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom the land belonged, along with all the people living on it. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but really rules, who decides the question of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. They came to the sea then Inge was about 5 or 6 years old, and she liked such outings very much. Though her family did not make them very often, there was always either work or not enough money. But several times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for a whole day to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy the favorite places, have lunch somewhere in a cafe, wander through the stores where they sell what they do not have in their town, and come home at nightfall to both mother and grandmother. And if any mysticism lived in their family's history, loved ones hoped to keep something from her. Mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone had let it slip, it was her. But Emily only averted her eyes. Let's hope everyone's forgotten, Jacob's grandmother pleaded. Is that thing bothering you? No. Then forget about it. And remember, you don't need to know everything. But it's my ear. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time," Mom sighed, catching her grandmother's gaze. She stopped talking halfway through the conversation, and just like that, she was cut off. No matter how much Amber pestered her, Mom never said another word on the subject. It wasn't until much later, when she resorted to the unseemly trick of eavesdropping, that Amber realized at least roughly what was going on. Mom often came to Grandma's house to sit up before bed, no matter how tired she was. Talking, discussing what had happened during the day, complaining about something, asking for advice that was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the scraps of those whispers that Amber learned the story. The rulers of the area had once lived in that old fortress on the mountain. To think where now only the wind walks the empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, even the ruins and those are scattered on the stones, before there was a boiling life. Thousands of people walked the stone-paved roads every day. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house, which should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress with blank walls and windows only to the courtyard, was the largest and stood on the very edge over the cliff. And inside it was known, but no one could tell about it in detail, there were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who angered the master, or prisoners, whom he hoped to exchange favorably, were imprisoned here for 20 years. Over the years, the fortress ceased to play its role. People had no need to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer inhabitants. To live near the sky, but to save on all other water, to go down to the valley for every little thing, it is a kind of a test. There remained old people, and those who were faithful to tradition, who wanted to die close to their native hearth and be buried in the old cemetery next to their relatives. There came a time when the host's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years, they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something of the former rulers in the family. All of them continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom this land together with all the people living on it belonged. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but truly rules, who decides matters of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. They came to the sea then. Amber was about 5 or 6 years old, and she loved such outings, though the household did not make them very often. There was always work or not enough money. But a few times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for the day, to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy their favorite places, eat lunch in a cafe, wander through the stores that sell things they don't have in their town, and with darkness falling, return home to their mother and grandmother. That day couldn't help but stick in the memory. Amber was wearing a light blue plaid sundress. She was already badly tanned, her blonde hair tangled by the wind. The beach was less crowded than usual. The wind, carrying sand in the face, scared away the vacationers, and the waves on the sea had risen. But Amber ran along the edge of the shore, once on the ankle ran into the water, then retreated so that the wave did not cover her head, then snatched out of the water some particularly brightly colored pebble. Even her mother, who was far from any creativity, was admiring her daughter at this moment. If there was an artist or photographer here now, he would definitely admire how good Amber was. The girl didn't know that another couple was watching her father and son, who were in a tent nearby. Not everyone could afford to rent a beach house, so most of the tents were empty. But on this windy day, the father and son were more comfortable with the brightly colored fabric protecting them from the flying sand. Look, said a boy of about 12, pointing to Amber. There was something haughty in his oriental appearance and mannerisms. Her father looked at the girl and raised his eyebrows questioningly. So, well, you choose who you like, the boy explained. And don't tell me that's not true. I'm not a little kid anymore, I know. Who told you what? Father asked nonchalantly. Yes, I know about the girl who jumped out of the window and crashed, too. Father stretched, put his hands behind his head and said, looking at the sea. Well, you see, our wishes don't always end well. But that's for you. It's different for me, the boy objected. The father grinned. Son Emir was the only person who could speak to him like that. No, he hadn't been brought up in the Oriental way, where a child is allowed to do anything until a certain age. Emir knew his turns, knew how to behave properly if he had to. And yet he had no fear of his father, and deep down he was sure that he would go much further than him. Every now and then it would come out. "Did you like her that much?" "I don't think she was pretty," Emir asked. "How much do you understand?" There was no embarrassment in his father's voice. He was just uncomfortable with the story. "Well, you chose that one, and I choose this one. I like her." "What are you going to do with her?" "Nothing for now. Let her live. When she's old enough, I'll take her back to our place." "You're like a Turk. They used to kidnap their brides." My father's tone was mocking, but there was genuine warmth in it. "I think it was more slaves," the boy said, surprised. Amber had been running up and down the beach, and now she wanted to swim. She was already pretty good in the water, but since her father wasn't with them, her grandmother made her wear a child's inflatable vest that fastened in the front with a drawstring. Amber ran to beg for permission to swim and was animatedly telling her grandmother something, gesticulating. Paul, his father, called to the gray-haired man who always accompanied them. He immediately bent down to his master. "Do you know who they are? From their appearance, it seems that if they have not come from far away." "Yes, Herman Yefimovich. We'd like to secure the girl for the future, so to speak." Pavel didn't point directly at Amber, but made a certain movement with his eyes. I see your point." Emir smirked. He realized that he had allowed himself more than usual, had behaved even brazenly, and was quite sure that his father would refuse him. But he had chosen a good day, and his father was in a good mood. And in general, it doesn't hurt to check the boundaries of permissible from time to time. Grandma and Mom were shocked when Paul and the makeup girls from the beauty parlor showed up at their house in the evening. Chewing gum in her mouth, one of them pierced Amber's ear and stuck an earring in it. The maiden, however, was apparently not evil. She chatted with the girl and said that they bring 2-year-olds to her, and in general there is nothing to talk about. 1, 2 and done. That earring is very pretty. It's a stone. Ruby, the stone of love. And it has a tiny little seal on it that you can see if you look closely. The family tried to be indignant at first, to say that it was out of the question, but Paul repeated twice something that frightened everyone and hinted that misunderstandings with this man could end badly. After all, taking Amber away now is the easy part, and there's little the police can do to help to everyone. The girl will just go missing. It happens, and trying to hide or take her away isn't an option either. If you get the urge, they'll get you from under the ground. Don't cry. Humanly speaking, I understand. I'll tell you what, no one will touch you now. Live as you have lived, raise your little girl. So much that all this will be forgotten quickly, and no one will ever remember you or that earring. But for some reason they put it on try not to cry. Mom, who was scared out of her wits, wiped away her tears with the palm of her hand. Paul shrugged. Well, what can you do when you're talking about a child? A ring or a bracelet. The baby is growing, the jewelry will quickly become tight. She'll lose the tip. An earring is a reliable thing. Did the slave owners think so too? Grandma put it in. Her voice was creaky for some reason. Stepfather Paul looked at her carefully. Well, you got it right. Once again I say, I'm almost certain that everything will be fine. With that he bowed out. That's the phrase the relatives clung to. If you sit quietly, do not try to fight, argue. If you do not get on the road, and look, it will pass. And it was hard to imagine a quieter life than the family led in the following years. Their town is small, less than 30,000 people live here, and it's 24 kilometers from the sea, so even in the summer there is no such pandemonium as on the coast. Mostly those who are interested in history come here. After all, on the maps of this place appeared in the 16th century. And there are plenty of real antiquities here. Caves along the lawn, in the mountains and rocks, where the first settlers huddled so densely that in some places the slopes of the mountains resemble honeycombs. But if you don't go where the tourists take you, the town is quiet and sleepy. Narrow streets, blank stone fences. That's the fence Amber grew up behind. And then when she reached out to people herself when she started working at the museum, the terrible incident was somehow forgotten and erased from her memory. It's been too many years. It's definitely forgotten now. Amber and her red mark. Her mother secretly followed the fate of the owner, knew that he lived abroad for several years. And when his father came back, his son was still out there somewhere. Yes, he studied in Europe. Mother knew that the master's distant ancestors had once owned a fortress, and now he had built himself a house before which the old fortress was only a pale reflection, a real castle on the seashore. And grandmother used to say that he sits there, God forgive him, like a spider to which the threads of everything dark, gloomy, illegal in their land are drawn. And the guy eventually came back. Why? Why wasn't he in Europe? His father had decided to gradually bring him up to speed, to hand over the reins of power. I just hoped Amber never met him. Amber would take the guests in her old car. Usually the less discerning ones would agree, and she'd drive them around the sites. Or her clients did not agree to drive anything but their own foreign cars. And then in the agreed place sat in their car, and then already took on the role of a guide. Today's job was a little more unusual than before. She had to pick up these guys right at the station. They'd arrived in a matter of days. Sports competitions, a tight schedule, and they wished for such a program. They'd get off the train and go on a tour. And then it's back to the hotel. What's Amber's main concern? That the group was small. As always, she never took more than 4 or 5 people, usually less. And the money had already been transferred to her card. So she stood on the platform and watched the cars slowly pass by. She recognized her clients at once, 3 young guys. One look at them and immediately diagnosed them as basketball players, and an older man with them. Even his whiskers are graying. The guys must have been inspired by the fact that their guide was such a young girl. But Amber, with a restrained smile, responded to the jokes at the attempted flirting, and then she got everyone in the car so that the oldest in the group was next to her in the front seat. The part of the road ahead was boring, through the steppe. Sometimes cab drivers ask passengers to talk to me, or I'm afraid I'll doze off at the wheel. But Amber was in no danger of that. After all, there were the steppe yaks and their battles, their chiefs, their mounds. Even here she managed to tell fascinating stories, poured the bird, and listened that tourists almost sighed with regret when the sea showed in the distance. After all, that meant the end of the story. She spoke to herself, looking in the mirror at the man sitting next to her. He reminded her of an elephant. Maybe it's called a Roman profile. But it seemed to Amber that his forehead went so smoothly, without curves, into his nose that it looked like a short elephant trunk. Amber thought back to last winter. She'd gotten lucky with an order then. She'd patronized a group flying in from St. Petersburg like chickens, and they hadn't wanted to let her go. They asked her to celebrate New Year's Eve with them at one of the most luxurious recreation centers. This, in addition to the fee for excursions. Those days were strange. Here, in their climate, where it rarely snows, it happens that you cannot wait for the whole winter. But then the New Year's week was snowy, and tourists did not know what kind of entertainment to think up. They skated on the artificial ice, and the bathhouse, that's for sure, and the equestrian club, and some even ordered a helicopter. And of course the New Year's celebration itself, when in a cafe stylized as a Russian terem, set the tables and until morning was to continue the fun and dancing. And Amber then ran away. She served her part with the band all evening in the arena and escaped to the cottage where they had put her up. One of the guests went after her. It was a dark-haired, pleasant, middle-aged man. He brought champagne and brought no hindsight. It was just that he was an introvert and didn't want to spend the rest of the night in a crowd. Better to sit in the living room with this nice girl, look at the fire in the fireplace and through the panoramic windows at the snow-covered, garland-lit forest, drink champagne and talk. Igor was married and regretted that it turned out so that his Olga could not come. Suddenly swamped with things at work, and the vouchers were already bought, and Olga kicked him out to rest for 2. And that's when Igor told Amber, "I think that every person is like some animal. And you? I'm like a dog, I guess." From Amber's point of view, he looked like a raccoon, short in stature, graceful, with deep-set and dark eyes. But Amber had remained silent out of politeness. But now she remembered him, because elephant was a very subtle definition. This time she drove the guests around almost until the evening. She showed them the main resort town. The local nice went aboard a sailing ship with them. It used to be filmed a lot in movies, but now it was a bar. They stood on the observation decks, drank water from the spring, drowned in legends, and bought as a souvenir burlap bags with fragrant herbs. The final point was a restaurant where they served fish that was still swimming in the sea in the morning. She was treated to local wines. Then Amber had to take her guests to the doorstep of the hotel. She didn't drink much wine, but the guys got pretty drunk. They felt like they were friends forever. And they asked Emily to come cheer them on at the competition tomorrow. "Can I ask you a favor?" the older man asked. Amber recognized him. His name was Jason, and he wasn't a coach or some kind of chaperone, just a friend of one of the boys' fathers, and he'd come along for the ride. She raised her eyebrows at him now, smiling welcomingly, but she really didn't like these unexpected requests. There was no telling what would pop into her head. "Amber, don't you take me to the fortress?" Kyle interrupted, and after the third drink he decided to switch to you with her. "No, I can't go to the fortress." "Why not?" Kyle's voice trailed off. You had to listen to him to make out the words. "Grandmother won't let me go." Kyle looked at her in amazement. "It's dangerous. Caves crumbling. Underground mazes. She won't let me in." "Well, what do you want?" Amber explained. Like her, Jason hadn't had much to drink that night. "There's a Gregory Evans living here. He's the landlord." Jason began slowly, "and they say he's built himself a castle that would make an English queen jealous. I'd like to take a closer look at it. I understand about private property and all that. But will you take me to a place where I can get a good view of the castle? I know it's over the top, but I'll pay." Amber stopped the car where few people would. Only someone who knows every rock, every ledge in the area. The road was narrow, a steep slope to the left, the sea below. Here, a dense forest. But at the sight of it, Amber remembered the marshes. The green and lush crowns gave the deceptive impression of a carpet. It looked like moss from afar, but you couldn't step on it, you'd fall through. To the right rose steep cliffs. Such cliffs can be climbed only with mountaineering equipment. No stranger would park here. But Amber found a small ledge. She parked her car so it wouldn't get in the way of anyone driving by. It wasn't a busy road, though it led to nowhere, to a small village with no sights, nothing of interest to tourists. "Here," Jason started, "I'll show you the path." Amber led him to a little noticeable path that went steeply downward, but still allowed him to get down to the sea. "Divers used to love this place," Amber explained. "They used to have a different road so you could drive a car to the water. These guys always have their gear with them. You know, tents, stuff like that. It's a lot of cargo. And then when they built the castle, they blocked the road. There was even a court case in the end. You know, between the people have a right and private property won. Some people tried to give a damn. Mostly not the people who live here, but the people who come here every year to snorkel. The water here is clear, and it feels like you're not swimming, but floating in the blue sky like an angel. Well, someone tried to ride like they used to. True, they chose a time when it was usually quiet early morning, late evening. They hoped no one would notice them. But people invariably stood on the road, guards, you wouldn't believe it, with real weapons, automatic rifles or something like that. All kinds of camouflage on their chests. So we realized it was serious, so we stopped trying. There's still this trail, it's off to the side. It was laid by the most stubborn. There's a forest almost all the way to the sea. You can go down and snorkel. It's a little awkward to climb back, but you can see the castle from there." Jason stared at her for a few seconds. Amber couldn't tell at once what she saw in that look of gratitude, but it was clearly something else. "Thank you, Amber." Anything further, he held out the money to her, but the girl only took one of the bills out of his hand. She was always honest about her work and didn't take tips. "How will you get out of here?" "Hitchhike." "There's a hitchhiker every half hour or an hour or less." Jason shrugged. It was a small thing to him. "Let me wait for you. My mom says the owner's so reclusive because the 90s aren't over for him." "No, girl," Jason said softly. "It all started earlier, much earlier, and thank you for the offer. But I'd like to be alone, and thank you also for the fact that without you, I wouldn't have found this path." He nodded his goodbye and started down the path, recognizing it for what it was. In some places, he had to hold on to tree roots to keep his balance. Sometimes the path was blocked by ravines, into which one had to descend and then climb down their slippery clay slopes. Really, you had to love diving to come here. Besides, whatever Jason was up to, it wouldn't be worth the delay. It was getting dark soon, and darkness in the south fell quickly, almost in an instant. It must have been about 20 minutes when the shore came into view. The forest had receded, and he saw a narrow strip of large pebbles. He also saw the castle. It rose up on his right hand and seemed to rise out of the sea, though it was built on a low cliff. It was built of stone of gray, but of such a dark shade that now in the evening light the castle seemed black. Some historian, architect, or art critic would have been tempted to argue that the castle was built in accordance with the traditions of the people who had lived here for centuries. It had nothing in common with Gothic and with those castles and palaces that could not protect their owners from enemies but were works of art in themselves. No, the man who built such a thing thought first of all of his own safety. Blank walls, windows as narrow as loopholes, gates as tall as 3 men. How much evil had to be done to be so afraid of retribution? And Jason remembered the morning Emily had disappeared. He sat at his computer early. He worked best in the morning hours. His head wasn't so clear after that. Emily brought him coffee, came up behind him. All he saw was her hand with the inexpensive metal bracelet. She was placing a steaming cup in front of him. Then he felt the touch of her lips on his hair. Emily kissed him lightly. "I'm off to the market." "Can you believe it's all over? Not even breakfast," she said. Engrossed in his work, he didn't realize until 10 o'clock when he felt hungry. Emily hadn't returned by then. It was unbearably sickening to think of what had followed. Desperate searching and terror in his soul from the first minute. Somehow he had been certain from the beginning that something very bad, terribly bad, had happened that could not be undone. Emily couldn't get lost, couldn't hang out with her friends. She didn't have any friends here either. Go to a movie or go swimming. Trouble happened. Emily was found about 2 weeks later on a beach just like this, by the water. And there was no way of knowing how she could have gotten there. She was lying on the rocks, a broken doll in tattered clothes. And it was only her face that her death had made completely calm. The police, who up to that point had been honestly searching for the young woman, suddenly led further investigation, as if they were certain of the only theory. And it was hardly Jason's fault. "You must have had a fight," the investigator insinuated. So she left. She'd taken her own life, as they say. Jason stared at her with shocked eyes. He couldn't even speak. He was at a loss for words. Emily was the most precious thing in his life. What would he be without her? Quite possibly just carelessness. The investigator retreated a little. The grounds here were beautiful. She wanted to get a closer look. The rocks under her feet crumbled, and she took off. "Are you saying that right from the market with a heavy bag without saying anything to anyone?" Emily went far away to admire the views. "And that's not bullshit to you?" The investigator shrugged. "Well, it's not like a woman can think of anything." It wasn't until later, asking everyone himself, that Jason found a young merchant who told him. "I saw Emily being pushed into the car. It happens to us," the trader said, averting his eyes. "Usually these women come back after a while. You were just unlucky." From the same man, Jason had learned about the all-powerful owner of this place. It's no use going to the police with this. He's not only got it in his pocket, they're scared shitless of him. And as you know, I wouldn't be a witness. Life, excuse me, is more precious. You're already attracting a lot of attention. You'll come home one day and his men will tell you to leave immediately, or they'll find you. Just like that, on the beach. Or maybe they won't find you at all. Wrap it up. You can't fight a crowbar, as they say. And Jason somehow knew Emily hadn't been killed. I mean, not literally killed. She'd gotten a minute and either tried to escape but failed or just threw herself from a height. She had never been afraid of heights in the mountains. One had to watch out for others all the time, keep an eye on her. And heights had done her one last favor. It had saved her from something Emily couldn't bear. Jason had taken her advice, but not because he'd decided to accept it, to forgive it, to forget it. It was just that the master's power here was absolute now, an armor in which no vulnerability could be found. But if you wait, if you put your whole life into waiting for your hour, your minute, your one and only minute, that chance would come sooner or later. Amber was waiting for him by the car. She was squatting on her haunches, picking through small stones, looking for clear quartz shards. It was a habit of hers. "Let's go," she said, getting up and shaking her palms off her shorts. "I knew you'd come out of the dark. I waited." He was genuinely surprised. "How could I leave you?" And yet the light was almost out. And the first thing Amber did when she got behind the wheel was turn on the headlights. "Mom, let's get out of here. I'm scared for some reason." Amber didn't expect those words to come out of her mouth. She'd known about her master her whole life, as long as she could remember, and she'd been to these places near his castle many times. But today this stranger, so strange, so a little like an elephant, by his mere presence stirred her. Now she had a premonition of bad things to come. Like an animal senses an earthquake coming. Her mother had just fed Amber some fried potatoes, poured her some tea, and returned to her knitting. "Where are we going?" she asked. There was a certain irritation in her voice. She knew Amber must have known that they were trapped and had nowhere to go. There wasn't a penny to spare in the family and no relatives or acquaintances willing to take them in. And how do you leave home? It's the only thing they got. Mom lived here for years without ever leaving. She was afraid of everything. She had never been abroad. She was afraid of foreign passports, a foreign language, incomprehensible money, which was incomprehensible how much it would be in rubles. At the first store you would be left without a penny. And my mother was afraid of her country, 2 trains with drunken shift workers, airplanes that crashed, pimps at train stations, swindlers and thieves. "If I go to my dad's?" Amber asked. "There's almost a direct train there, with only one change at the very end." "Don't even think about it." Mom jumped up. "He really needs you. He's already got a son and a daughter. Let him take care of them." "I'm not saying move in with him," Amber corrected her mom gently. "Just in the same town as him. Maybe he'll give me a job and then I'll get an apartment. I'm an adult, Mom, and you're wrong to say he doesn't want me. He's been sending me money for my birthday all these years, you know it. It's in your book." Grandma looked at Mom with an expression that clearly said, "See, I was right," and Mom was embarrassed. But she quickly found a clue. "No, no, no, no. I'm not letting you on a train across the country." "I had an acquaintance," Grandma said melancholically. "She was older than me. As a child, she survived in the trenches of Stalingrad. Then she graduated from a fishery technical school and was sent to Sakhalin. She was small in stature, with a point, black eyes, and a big bow in her braid. She traveled with geologists to Vladivostok on a train across the country on the 3rd shelf somewhere, because there were not enough seats. Then by boat to the island, and worked there as a foreman at the combine." Her mother's eyes darted, fingers begging her to stop this conversation, not to lead Amber astray. Amber went to the fortress. It was a kind of place of power for her. The ruins had been closed off from tourists for a while permanently. The risk of accidents had become too great, and the caves and underground passages had to be reinforced to prevent an unexpected collapse. But there was no place in their neighborhood where Amber didn't know the secret paths. Leaving the car at the foot of the hill, she began to climb up the mountain. And the town died out. Here and there remnants of towers, crooked streets half erased by time, a cemetery. Caves, roofed in the rocks, long ago deserted dwellings, debris, stones, dust and ashes, where the eye finds no joy. 2 or 3 families, like shadows, wander among the bare walls, but barracks for them are native hearths and the temple of their fathers. A black car, over which smooth circles, soaring, draws an eagle on the mountain heights. These lines, written long ago, really came to life here, in these ancient walls, although now it was no longer possible to meet even 2 or 3 families here. Amber had spent the night here once. Of course, withheld from her loved ones, not on a bet, and not with a young man. It was just that since childhood she had felt her belonging to this ancient fortress, her kinship with those who lived here. It was well known about her host's ancestors that they owned the very house of which only ruins remained. But Amber knew from somewhere that her great-grandparents had come from this area. Maybe one of them had been a potter or a small merchant who went down to town every day, set up shop. Or maybe there isn't even dust left of their house now. But their souls, they were still here. These people, generation after generation, had survived here, where every drop of water was precious, and where even grass grew so sparsely on the sun-hot rocks. Survived, fought off enemies, and stayed here after the master's family left. Which meant this place was theirs by right, not stolen from them by legal violence. Amber told her friend at home that she'd stay the night, but she went up to the fortress in the late afternoon and found a spot near the crossroads. There were bushes of dried wormwood poking through the paving stones. There was still a stone arch over one of the roads. Nearby were 2 nations' ancient temples. One simpler, smaller, trimmed in wood, the other larger, with heavy columns, with doors that in Amber's memory were perpetually locked, though she peered through the windows, trying to see what was inside. The sunset made the fortress an absolutely fantastic sight, and it was particularly vivid itself. It seemed that Amber had never seen such vivid colors of the sky, rich purples, golds, and purples. It was the hour when that which was unimaginable and fabulous in the daytime awakens all the otherworldly power whose breath is in the air in a way that cannot be put into words. Amber sat here until dawn. At times she was sure she could make out faint light shadows, swift or slow, but she felt no fear. She waited for someone to speak to her, or to give her some sign. Above her head were large stars, like grains of shining salt. Every now and then a long streak of a meteorite could be seen. Amber remembered her childhood. She'd been given a little Umka telescope, and it had been a real shock for her to see for herself, with her own eyes, that the moon was not a golden disk, so natural in the night sky and in pictures that it was almost unnoticeable. No, the moon is a stone ball, riddled with lunar craters, and it hangs in the black void of space. It's one thing to read about it, but it's another to see it. It took her a long time to catch a glimpse of meteors, even though her grandmother had told her, "There's a bright one coming." When Amber finally saw the flying stars, she remembered her father's hands as he struck a match to light a cigarette. And she thought maybe God was doing it up there in the sky. Then her legs got stiff, and she stood up, thinking that every step she took would make a thudding sound on the paving stones beneath her feet. But she walked quite silently, like a spirit, reached the temple and stroked one of the columns. It was a movement of which she was not aware to herself. And then she walked down the alley under the archway, and inhaling the bitter odor of wormwood, thought that this was what the stars smelled like. She did not go down into the dungeon, though she had been there before. But she had not brought a flashlight, and without it she was afraid of tripping on the steps, stumbling, falling somewhere. So she walked outside the fortress walls and went to the tomb, the obelisk above which was particularly high on the mountainside. Amber knew that a very young girl was buried here. She had died while even younger than Amber was now. A girl from a wealthy family had carried water to the fortress during the siege. Skinny as she was, she managed to slip between the bars of the fence. She made the journey again and again with the heavy burden, and her heart failed her. The bird girl. Then Amber met the dawn next to the grave, but there was still no fear. On the contrary, the feeling that she was not alone was growing in her. Of course, Amber never said a word at home about her nighttime escapade. Mom would have been heartbroken, and Grandma would have freaked out in hindsight. But many times after that, Amber had come here in times of need to regain her inner strength and composure. And now she sat in complete silence for a long time on the grass at the edge of the road. Only the wind ruffled her hair and occasionally sang in the narrow streets like the distant sound of strings. Today she was driving a new group, a husband, wife, and 2 children. The family didn't want to buy shared excursions. With children, you can never guess what if they get carsick, have to stop the car, and what if they get thirsty or have to go back. And the program the mother and father asked to adjust to the children. The girl was 8 and the boy was 5. Not tiring, not hot, interesting, and a place to get drunk and eat. Amber took them to the Museum of Fairy Tales and walked with her guests along the paths of the park for a long time, talking about fairy tale characters as well as an experienced guide. She worried while the children wondered and marveled to their heart's content to have their pictures taken. Then they had a snack at the cafe and had to finish the day at the observation deck. We had to give the adults a chance to admire the beauty of the area too. For Amber, the main charm was the sea always alive, with its brightest holiday colors, blue, 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 green, and the vegetation still below. Drowning in the greenery of the southern city was very nice. It was a weekday, and this observation deck was not one of the most famous. So when they'd come here, Amber had figured and had no doubt already that they'd be alone on the platform. But at the very last moment they were cut off by a car, a white Cherokee Jeep. It cut them off so unexpectedly and brazenly that it could have been bad. Amber almost drove off the road, and that would have been a disaster. Serpentine roads everywhere, steep slopes everywhere. She felt an icy dread. Not so much for herself, but for the strangers in the car. Damn it. She almost never argued with other drivers, never got into arguments. And though almost always, if something happened on the road, it wasn't her fault, Amber swallowed the chicken that you can't let those women drive and the brainless blonde just as long as they'd leave her alone. But now, when she saw that the Jeep had stopped near the same lot where they were headed, Amber couldn't help herself. She slammed the door and strode toward the black car, taking the distance between them in 4 strides. "Are you crazy?" She lashed out at the guy who stepped on the ground. "Do you realize you almost got us all killed?" and she faltered. Because this Ambo looked at her without the slightest sense of guilt, with such a slight smirk, as if not a person, but a bug he got on the road, which he was about to crush with his foot. And then she recognized him. His portrait was not published in the newspapers, but she often found references to him and his photographs on the internet. Too often the owner's son was involved in all sorts of stories. And usually in a car he'd race with his friends at breakneck speed through the city at night and hit someone, or he'd get into a fight he'd provoked, or there'd be an absolutely scandalous orgy party, for no one had the courage to call it anything else. Resentment struggled with fear in Amber. Especially as it turned out, Emir wasn't traveling alone in the car. He never rode alone, and two of his friends of the same age and perhaps even stronger build were now standing beside him, grinning just as unkindly. Amber remembered the earring. She wanted to see if it covered her hair, but didn't dare. She could only hope that the curly blonde strands hid her earlobes, but it was a futile hope. "I remember you," Emir said, ignoring Amber's anger, ignoring her mood. "Were you the one slapping bare heels on the beach back then? You couldn't forget me either. You're still wearing my sign." He looked at her like a landlord coming home to check on his possessions. "You were such a little girl then. I thought you'd never grow up to be anything good. But you turned out to be pretty good." The tourists started getting out of the car. Amber should have gone with them, but she stood stiffly as the owner's son walked around her, looking at her from every angle. Looking at her from every angle. "Where do you live? What do you care? What do you really care? Because you're coming with us now." "I'm not." "Who's going to ask you?" The smirk got even wider. Amber knew it was useless to yell. There was no one around to stand up for her but the father of the family. Still, as she was dragged to the car, she cast desperate glances at the family. Unless these people were afraid, if they could tell. You didn't see anything. One of the customers approached them, after the Jeep door had already slammed shut and swallowed Amber. "Is that clear? But how are we going to get out of here? We don't even know where we are." The man didn't dare say anything, the woman decided. And his voice wasn't shaking. "Shuttle you'll catch." With these words, the guy got into the car and the Jeep sped off so sharply that it almost drove over the tourists' legs. They barely had time to bounce, and a few more minutes coughing, because such a dust rose. The adults were so impressed by the experience that they could not immediately begin to talk, although the children, and break them, trying to understand what was happening. It was late in the evening when Amber's mother came to the hotel where the family was staying. She was distraught and found her daughter's notebook, where Amber had written down the schedule of her excursions and the phone numbers of her clients. Only she, this crying woman, not the police, had dared to tell the husband and wife what had happened on the observation deck. But they didn't remember the license plate number, saying they were in shock. They didn't care. And they stood firm on that. They couldn't give us a good description of the guy. A big guy in a black t-shirt with some friends with him. And then they watched through the window as the small figure of a woman, covering her face with her hands, went away. Into the night. "Just don't throw me into a thorn bush," the phrase popped into Amber's head. And it somehow became the only thing she could cling to like a lifeline. They'd been driving for about 10 minutes now. Amber was sandwiched in the back seat between two thugs. She tried to ignore their dirty jokes. She was the only one who needed to scratch out a ghostly chance at salvation. "Are you taking me to the castle?" Amber asked briefly, still ignoring Emir's friends. "Why? Have you wanted to go there for a long time? Really? Not only a tour guide, but also a call girl. I haven't seen all the clients' houses yet." "You haven't." "That's true. You guys don't let anyone in. You're like spiders in a web. But there's always a way out." "And what is your way out?" "I assure you, the gate is like a door to a safe. A flea can't get through. You won't escape, will you?" "There is a way out. I've already escaped through your father's window. I'm not afraid of death. Don't think about chewing through the bars with your teeth." He nodded at her wrist. Something had changed. Almost imperceptibly, but Amber felt it. "Aren't you afraid of anything?" Emir asked. The iron confidence and mockery were gone from his voice. "Why, nothing." Amber spoke in a deliberately harsh tone that she had never spoken before in her life. "I'm afraid of the fortress. They say there are ghosts there in droves. They step on each other's toes." I had a friend stay there for a night on a dare and she nearly went mad. I'm not afraid of that lock thing you've got going on. Yeah, that's a good idea. One of the guys came to life. It's under reconstruction. None of the people are there. Let's stick her in one of those holes. She'll sit there for a day or two and then we'll take her back. It'll be silk. It's better than if that rabid thing starts gnawing on her own veins. Or your throat. Emir thought for a minute, and then became lively. Come on, let's do it. He had a premonition of unusual entertainment. There was almost nothing left unavailable to him in this world. He was already satiated. But to shake the family history, for his ancestors had put their enemies, or perhaps captives, in those dreadful caves. It was tempting to do as they did. This fool won't run away. Even if there is a small window in such a cave, it is very narrow. You can't fit through it. And if you turn around, you'll find yourself under a cliff. Then all you can do is throw yourself down, just to be sure. And if that crazy woman throws herself down, no one will ever think anything of Emir. It's not the same old story with Dad. The owner could do almost anything, but it took a lot of money to cover up that old story. And here's a careless girl climbing a mountain and getting killed. It's her own fault. But Emir had no doubt the girl would never get out of those underground passages. Jason bought a hunting rifle, according to all the rules, having collected the documents and having a hunting ticket. But it was not worth looking for it afterward in the company of those who wanted to shoot a bird or kill a boar. Afterward, he laundered the trophies. Sharing tales, Jason retreated into the woods. Loneliness had long been his shadow, his second self, and he'd come back without any booty. He had another goal in mind, to preserve his sniper skills and that inner focus that would so easily be lost in the shooting range. Jason needed that inner determination and willingness to pass the point of no return as much as he needed a steady and accurate hand. He would go far away where no other hunters could get to him and where no one could hear the sound of the shot. Jason would only shoot at a target until he felt he was ready for anything that might come out of his scheme. All these years he'd spent money on himself more than sparingly, royalties set aside. And by the time it was decided it was time, he had enough saved up to buy a black market sniper rifle. If Amber's mother kept an eye on her master's life, not for any particular purpose, more out of caution, she sighed in relief when she heard he was leaving the country. Jason, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was waiting for. Even the strongest enemy has a moment of weakness, a moment when he opens up. He had to wait patiently for that moment, not to miss it. When Amber led him to the closest place to the castle, Jason realized once again that it was useless to look for luck here. The castle was too far away from people and too well protected. It wasn't worth trying to get to someone hidden behind its walls. There were other options to consider: access roads, places in the city where the owner occasionally visited. Jason knew he would wait patiently, that he would lay his life on it and wait. After all, what would happen to himself afterward was of no concern to him. He didn't think about the consequences, and frankly didn't care about them. But he realized how carefully he had to think over every step, so that his life's work would not remain unfinished. At the hotel, he took a room on the second floor with a low-hanging balcony. It wasn't always easy for an outsider to get onto the front of the building, but it wouldn't be a problem for him to get out of here himself if the need arose. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here, so he paid for 2 weeks for now. He'd see how long it would take. He went to the market where Emily had gone on her last day. He needed to get in tune with her. From a common sense point of view, it was inexplicable. But the chance we get often defies all logic. Over the years, the market has become almost unrecognizable. New pavilions and signs have appeared. But this place was revived as early as it is now, although most of the resort visitors were still asleep. Traders were already laying out their goods on the stalls. There had once been merchants in the ancient fortress too, and they had come down every day to set up their shops. Jason remembered that there had been competition then, and he'd been quietly discouraged from taking cucumbers from Peter or apricots from Ahmed. He waters his garden with cesspool waste. Fertilizer, you'll want, he was told. But how could one pass by golden curd, velvety pure apricots, purple grapes, or cucumbers just plucked from the bed? It was impossible to think of anything else but the blissful satisfaction of hunger. Now the early customer was welcome, and the first saleswoman grabbed Jason with her chatter in her hands, which were already placing the clear yellow plums on the scales. But as he counted out the money, Jason froze, listening to the conversation of the women next door with their wares. That's how that girl got stolen and taken away in broad daylight. The mother's ready to go to the noose. Yeah, I know that family. The last thing I thought was that they'd be the ones to get into this kind of trouble. Always so quiet, always the first to say hello when they meet. That girl Amber is either 18 or 19 years old. And why her? Well, she's pretty, I'll give her that. How did you find out? The mother, it turns out, kept it a secret from everyone that her girl had a crush on this boy years ago. Now Amber hasn't come home, and the mother's looking for her, because the police are notoriously unreliable. People who saw it all happen, who saw her being dragged into the car, have come forward. But well, if there are witnesses, will the police let it go this time too? So what witnesses? They all got scared, quickly packed up and left. And now they'll have to find them. And the mothers will say it's all a fabrication, said the full-figured shopkeeper, shifting the apricots so carelessly that the soft sides of the apricots were pitted by her fingers. By God, I think I'm going mad. This is medieval. The master is the Lord. It's always been like that in my lifetime. And it will go on my son has grown up there, said another. And what is your mother not afraid to tell now? Isn't it too late for her to realize it? What has she got to lose? The only hope now is that everybody will know about it. Maybe then that scum will be ashamed to go all the way. He'll let her go in the end. After he's played with her, he'll let her go. When did this happen? Jason asked, forgetting about the change the peddler was counting out for him. I found out yesterday, the full-figured woman said. That's the kind of thing we get. You come here like you're in paradise for a vacation, but not everything is so peaceful and quiet. Who can give me the address of this family? Jason asked. Please. Do you want to help one guest? Well, help. They've always lived poor, and Mom's sure going to need the money now. I don't know whether she's at home or in the hospital. How much medicine costs, can you imagine? Tell me the address, I'll remember it. It wasn't 20 minutes before Jason knocked on the gate of the house on the quiet street. The gate was 3 boards, the brown paint peeling off long ago. There was no bell, but even a delicate knock was enough for the unlocked gate to open by itself. Jason followed the path through the garden to the house. 2 women were sitting on the open veranda. One, very old, slouched in a chair with armrests and red eyes. The other, younger, stood toward him, clamping her hands over her mouth, apparently in no doubt what news he had brought. And Jason's heart ached in a way it hadn't in years. It was as if he'd been transported back to the hour he'd learned of Emily's death. Jason raised his palms in a soothing gesture. I didn't bring bad news. I want to learn something and maybe help. But you're not the police, said the younger one, the mother. And there was more affirmation in it than questioning intonation. Jason realized she was already there. Already tried to raise everyone's ears. It didn't work. She'd been told something like, wait, a young girl's been out for 3 days, ran away, decided not to let you know. Now mother and grandmother were hitting this uncertainty like birds against glass. Their hearts were about to fail. I'm not the police, he said, and he could hear the change in his voice. I understand that you know who your Amber is in whose hands, and that this man has had his eye on her for a long time. That is correct. And a picture of your daughter I'd like to see, if I may. The mother shrugged her shoulders shakily. The shawl thrown over them, apparently grabbed from the bed, didn't help. She went quickly into the room and soon returned with a red-bound album, an old album, the kind they used to glue pictures of children from birth many years ago. Her mother opened the album to the last page, stroked the picture of a pretty blonde-haired girl with big, clear eyes. There was nothing of the modern girl in her. She looked like an easy victim who had fallen into the golden hands of Cochet, who would take her wherever he wanted. I'll hire a hitman, mother said. Sell everything we have, this house, everything. And we'll hire someone to kill that rotter at last. Tanya, Grandma raised her voice. The thing to think about right now was how to help Amber. No such thoughts just yet. Mother dropped her head on the table and cried with her grief. That's right, it had all come to pass. It was as if she were standing over Amber's coffin. It was impossible to question her now, and Jason got the story from his grandmother. She, too, had changed in the last 24 hours. If Jason had known her before, he would have seen how she had aged. Now she was an old woman sitting in front of him, immersed in herself, a little crazy. But he didn't know what to say to both of them, because now all he had to do was risk everything, and no one knew what the consequences of his move would be. What can you do for her? Again, it was not the mother who asked, but the grandmother. The mother was still unable to speak coherently. "I'll try to find out where she is. And then it will depend on the circumstances. One more question, please. I know this is difficult for you, but I need to know. You know Amber best. If she escaped, where would she go? Would she go back home, or would she try to hide somewhere? Would she run to the police, or would she go far away without saying a word to anyone?" Mother raised her head. At these words, she and grandmother exchanged glances. The fortress, grandmother said. It had always been the place dearest to her. A place of strength, as they say. She would run there for comfort, and you can hide there so that no one can find you. It's a veritable underground labyrinth. You know that ancient fortress in the cave city. It's undergoing restoration. But somehow I don't doubt that Amber would run there. Jason closed his eyes a little, signaling that he'd taken note. "Why don't I go there myself?" His mother jumped up. "What if she's really gone and is hiding there?" "I'll go and call." "Don't even think about it," he said sharply. "Nowhere, not a single step now, so as not to hurt your daughter or yourself. Your job is to wait. Do you realize how hard it is to wait and do nothing? Have you ever been through anything like this, been in our shoes?" The last thing Jason would do in his life is tell Amber's grief-stricken relatives about Emily. Because they still had a chance. There was hope. She didn't. She didn't. Amber really knew the underground labyrinths well. Of course, she couldn't go through all of them. Many of the passages were simply blocked, and no one was going to clear them. Cave vaults were crumbling, their corridors becoming impassable. She was risking everything, too. The company she'd fallen into could do anything to her first. There were no witnesses, and then dump her in one of the stone bags to make her go mad. No water, no food, and utter despair. Or even pushed off a cliff. Then again, who would see? But she was just beaten, tastefully, heartily. And then they pushed her into that death chamber that the tour guides liked to scare tourists with. Apparently, Emir and his accomplices did not know these places so well, and this cave was known to everyone. Some said that they could put a prisoner here for decades, setting a completely insane ransom for him. Others said it was the place of execution, and they described in vivid color exactly how. Now, the narrow entrance was closed by an iron grate, but Emir, it turned out, had a key to it. He must have inherited it from his great-grandfather. "This is where you'll sit." Amber was shoved back so hard that she couldn't keep her feet and fell to her knees on the stone floor. "Maybe we'll stop by again tomorrow," Emir smirked, savoring every word and trying to catch the look of horror in her eyes. He didn't wait. "The day after tomorrow, then. We have to bring you water, poor thing. But we'll only give it to you if you ask for it very nicely." "Meet us on your knees with your mouth open," advised one of his buddies. Cheeky. Malnourished, covered in rashes. Amber couldn't let her hatred suffocate her now. Make her do something rash. She walked to the back of the cave, her cell, settled on the stone ledge, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared out the window. "Are you getting into character?" Kyle Smith wondered. "Like, go ahead and practice with the ghosts until we get there." They left, laughing, deliberately loudly discussing the next time they'd visit her. What would they do to her then? Amber didn't move until her acute hearing stopped picking up the sound of their footsteps and voices. There was the sound of a car pulling away, and then she caught her breath. Amber stood up and walked over to one of the windows cut into the stone. Rough, irregular squares, just enough to let light into the cave and gauge the thickness of the stone walls. The cave was cold, and it would get even colder at night. Amber knew she didn't have much time. Very little. 24 hours, maybe less, and no one would come here in that time. She didn't even doubt that. She couldn't think about her mother and grandmother going crazy at home. The thought of that was mentally distressing. But Amber couldn't suppress the agonizing feeling of thirst. She'd spent the entire day in the heat. She hadn't eaten since this morning. And then there was the worry. She walked slowly around the cave, examining every stone, tapping her fingers on it, but she couldn't see a glimmer of hope anywhere. The cave had been cleaned just for tourists, so that through the iron grating they could see the manicured walls, not the bare stone and ledge that had replaced the prisoner's bench and bed. And there's a rusty piece of iron sticking out. It must have been used to attach a chain if it was to be put on the prisoner to intimidate him. Night came and brought no relief. Amber's eyes adjusted to the darkness quickly enough. It wasn't complete thanks to the windows. The night was clear, the moonlight walking through the cave from end to end. Amber was cold, but she didn't notice it herself. Her mind, however, seemed ready to boil. She searched again and again for a way out and didn't find it. But far more terrible than the night was the whole of the next day, when, beginning in the morning, she waited every minute for the arrival of her tormentors. She wondered exactly what they had in mind and realized that she had nothing at all, to defend herself. Every sound made her freeze and hold her breath. But they didn't come. Maybe they thought they'd give her a hard time, make her more cooperative. Maybe Kyle was just distracted by other things. By the evening of the second day, the thirst was almost unbearable. Amber thought seriously about the possibility that maybe some moisture would show up on the stone walls at night from the temperature difference and could be licked off with her tongue. There was no way to open the iron grate on the door, no way to dig under it. There was no earth here at all, just rock. The only thing Amber tried was to squeeze through the window. She almost succeeded, but it was the very last step, a desperate move. The only way to get out the window and plummet into the abyss was if there was no other way out and death was preferable. This is my fortress, my place, Amber thought, pressing her forehead against the cold stone. Why the hell can't I do this? Is it really hopeless and these walls won't do anything to help me? She navigated the stars pretty well and fell asleep probably around midnight. But she didn't sleep long, about 2 hours. She woke up when it was starting to get light. It was nearing dawn. But the windows of the cave faced north, and it was still dark, though in the east the sky must have already turned blue. At first she thought she was dreaming, because it couldn't be. In the corner of the cave, in the darkest corner of the cave, stood a girl. She was probably about 10 or 12 years old. Fragile, thin, as if she were just bones, wearing a floor-length cherry dress that seemed to glow slightly. The girl's hair was braided and she wore a cap like a bonnet on her head. Amber began blinking frequently and even clenched her eyelids, because it couldn't be anything other than hallucinations from nerves and dehydration. The girl walked over to her. Amber realized that if it wasn't a vision of her inflamed brain, she was facing a ghost. But the little visitor was not transparent, only very pale. She picked up a pitcher, and a pitcher she happened to have, and gave Amber a drink. Never afterward could Amber forget drinking that strange water, or rather the mist that flowed from the jug. But it quenched thirst, and more than that. It gave her strength back. Shinika, Amber asked quietly, "Is that you?" The girl blinked, just as Amber had done before. She was very small, very sad, and lonely to the point of heartbreak. Maybe it had been centuries since she'd had anyone to visit her, no one to fetch water for her. With inaudible steps, the girl went to the wall and lay down on the very iron that was sticking out of the stone. Nothing happened, but Amber understood her perfectly. 2 steps were enough for her to get next to the piece of metal and do what the little guest had done, lean on it with her chest and arms. The slit that opened in the wall was so narrow it looked like a trap. Step into it, and it would crush you. The girl was no longer behind Amber, but in front of her, somewhere in the dark depths, and there was a faint glow coming from it. And the girl didn't hesitate any longer. She stepped into the cramped corridor and walked, not even walked, squeezed between the walls. Sometimes she had to make an effort to move on. And if something happened here, no one would ever find her. She realized that clearly. Enthusiasm gradually waned. She was going down somewhere, and the way went on endlessly. She seemed forbidden to think about anything. She had to keep going as long as she had the strength. And then, too inwardly, she tuned in to the fact that she would fall in the end. And maybe that wouldn't be the worst outcome. So she was startled to the core when suddenly there was a whiff of fresh night air, and they found themselves in a small cave-like alcove at the very foot of the mountain. They had climbed out. There was the trail that ran down from the fortress. Amber looked around in panic, searching for the girl with her gaze, but no one was near her anymore. Only there, somewhere up on the slope where the girl's grave was, a light flashed for a moment and then went out. Or maybe it was just a star falling. By the end of that first day after Amber's disappearance, Jason knew the license plate numbers of the cars that belonged to the owner's family and his cronies. Amber could have been kept in a castle, most likely where it was even more convenient to hide loose ends, and in case of such a need, literally. And yet there was still some chance that she'd been handled differently, that she was hidden somewhere, and that chance couldn't be dismissed. Jason waited. He had managed to get much closer to the castle unnoticed than Amber had led on. He was almost beside the road, and only a keen eye would have recognized him in the green thicket. The sniper rifle was with him, and he would be in trouble if one of his master's men had spotted him. There was no other way to interpret his behavior than ambush and hunt. It wasn't the eagles he'd chosen to hunt. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here before he learned something, got a clue. But he hadn't left here yet in the late afternoon, and it was already clear that he was going to spend the night. Jason fell asleep with his head resting on the damp forest floor. His hearing was keen, and it was unlikely that anyone would be able to approach him undetected. Jason had no idea that at some point his sleep would become so sound that it would transport him to another dimension, where what he saw was real. He saw a country and a girl, as if coming from the depths of time. The clothing had a purple hue that made it impossible to distinguish the gender in the darkness. It was something like a long dress, the kind you see in ethnographic museums. The girl stepped back, giving him a view of the cave, and there was Amber, sitting on a stone ledge. The panorama shifted, as if a movie camera had decided to film the background. Now the ancient fortress lay before him like a palm of his hand, and it was there that the cave was. The prisoners were in it. He himself looked at it all, lying on the mountainside with a rifle in his hands. It was early morning. A black Jeep was driving down the road below. Jason was awake before dawn had even broken. There was no fatigue, no heaviness in his head. On the contrary, he knew exactly what to do now. He didn't have to decide what was going to happen next. It was as if everything had been decided for him. Children are not responsible for their fathers, but sometimes it is clear from the very beginning that they will surpass them. And would a bullet between the eyes be punishment enough for the master? Suffering measured in moments. But to mourn the flesh of his flesh, the one he nurtured and raised to replace him, it would take years and end with life. It was getting light when Jason reached the town where he'd started on his way to the fortress. It took him another half hour or so to climb up to the ruins of the fortress, and then climbing higher to the top to take the place he had seen in his dream. Now the whole road lay before him. Anyone approaching he would see from a distance, and he would have time to take aim. He didn't even make an attempt to find Amber. A different task now faced him. Logically speaking, the owner's son couldn't have gotten here this early. Jason had to cover his eyes to bring his image back to life. Tall, with a fresh, plump face, large lips, clenched fists. A fortunate man who had never known hard work, but was used to taking down the defenseless. So used to it that he didn't even expect his victims to resent him. Only fear was on the faces raised to him in supplication. For a moment, feelings came over Jason. Such mental strife. He lowered his head and breathed evenly to keep from throwing up. Emir couldn't have gotten here earlier, because that fat turkey would probably be asleep before lunch. But Jason had seen his car against the dawn sky in a brief vision, and now he waited. When the murmur of an engine was heard in the distance, all he had to do was move the barrel of his rifle. He was no longer a man, he had become a fearless machine, and all the measurements, calculations were going on as if outside his consciousness. He did not even try to hit the darkened windows of the Jeep. The shot hit the tire. And that was enough. Afterward, Jason stood full length on the mountain, a black silhouette against the dawn sky, and stared at the car that had gone down, flipped over, rolled over twice hard, and finally burst into a tall fire. He had a little time. He knew that the fire would be visible from afar, that it would not be long before people would be rushing here. But he did not try to hide now, even though he should have covered his tracks as soon as possible. He walked toward the fortress because he knew it was the right thing to do. And he was not surprised when he saw the figure of a girl in the distance. She froze, and then slowly began to rise toward him. He had better not meet her, because if he didn't get one chance for luck, they would look for him on the ground and underground. They'd dig deep and they'd find him eventually. He couldn't let anyone suggest that Amber's fate had anything to do with him. Jason had his own reason for revenge, and more than a good one. He didn't believe that the dead forgave everything and everyone, that they didn't care about earthly matters. Jason thought that Amelie was only now truly at peace. He also knew that everything he'd signed up for, sending the car into the abyss, was justified, and that no matter what happened to himself, it was okay, because that girl was alive and would live, and no one would ever hurt her again. And he'd only go near her for a minute to make sure she was safe. Amber was already standing 2 feet away from him, and yes, she was in one piece, but there was blood on her cheek and hair. Jason held out his hand as if asking, "What is it?" "He is, isn't he?" Amber asked, pointing at the chasm. The man nodded. Then she unclenched her palm, which held the ruby earring torn from her ear. Amber wanted to throw it into the chasm too, but the earring flew a few feet away and disappeared into the dry grass. How Helen hated sad funeral ceremonies. Well, of course, no one asked her permission to live or go beyond the border, to a place from which no one could return. And now, as soon as she saw the inscription Julia, neighbor on the smartphone screen, her heart sank with an unpleasant feeling. "Helen, hello baby. It's on Julia who worries. Sorry to bring you bad news this morning, but your father's phone isn't answering, so I have to bring grief down on you. George died. I was going to work and saw him sitting in an apple tree. I look, he seems to be doing something," half turning towards the street. Well, I wave to him and say, "Good morning." I ask what he was doing early in the morning, and George showed zero emotion to me, didn't even move. Although you know that my voice is loud, it's impossible not to hear. I went up to George, but he wasn't breathing. While I'm sitting here on the porch, I called all the necessary services, except for the ritual. It's not for me to decide how to see off George, but to be honest, I need to go to work. "Would you come?" Testedly responded in a hoarse voice. "Of course, Aunt Julia. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The sad news that her paternal grandfather, the always cheerful and cheerful George, had overcome the last milestone came as a real shock to Helen. We have to go, of course, organize everything, call everyone from grandfather's phone book. However, I wanted to convince myself that this conversation with my neighbor about my grandfather was just a bad dream. Now all you need to do is open your eyelids wide and look at the call history on your smartphone and make sure that there was no call." Unfortunately, this hope was not justified, and there really was a call from Aunt Valia. And the girl did everything possible to quickly get to her grandfather's house, located within the city, but in the so-called private sector. Having already got into the taxi car that had arrived on call, Helen asked her boss for a day off, then had a short conversation with her office colleague, explaining where the documents were, which, as luck would have it, the customers were supposed to come for today. The girl never dared to make the most difficult call. How to inform your father and mother, who have flown away on vacation to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, that they urgently need to return to say goodbye to grandfather George. Helen became sad. How unexpectedly this tragedy happened. Just the day before yesterday, she called her grandfather. He said that he was waiting for a visit and asked him to come quickly. Not for the sake of caring for a small garden, but to talk on some issue, to seek it. Helen promised to be there on the weekend that had recently flown by. She could have easily visited her grandfather, but she got a little sick, postponed the visit, called and apologized. They chatted for a bit about nothing. Grandfather George recalled the method that his wife Kristen and grandmother Helen always used. The girl listened that she needed to brew special herbs, wait until the infusion cooled to a pleasant warmth, stir a spoonful of honey in a glass of healing liquid, drink it, and lie down under the blanket. She promised that she would undergo intensive treatment and then visit him. And in the first month of autumn, when she had a vacation scheduled, the girl promised to stay with him for at least a week. Lord, how embarrassing. Now Helen was ashamed that she was going to wait for her vacation. After all, by public transport with transfers, you could get to grandfather in 45 minutes. When there were no traffic jams on the roads, you could even after work go not home, but to a loved one who had been incredibly bored alone for a little over a year. Moreover, it was uneasy that she was a free girl and could easily keep a lonely grandfather company. It would be quite possible to go to work and back by taxi. Of course, it would be more expensive than using public transport, but it would be quick and comfortable. Alternatively, you could simply leave the house a little earlier in order to walk to the transport stop from which the tram of the required route departs. Everything could absolutely be resolved, sorted out somehow. But he didn't have the insight to understand that Grandpa George needed care and supervision, and his requests to come were not just the whim of a bored elderly man. Helen was tormented by a painful feeling of shame, and sighing, she tried to call her parents. However, both Mom and Dad's numbers were out of network coverage. The girl had to send a letter by email, hoping that the unpleasant news would be read not too late. While solving troubles and questions, the time on the way to my grandfather's house flew by unnoticed. Helen got out of the taxi and, listening to Aunt Valia's sympathetic remarks, felt real grief falling on her. The neighbor hugged the girl who arrived, asked her to hold on, and ran to work. Helen looked at her grandfather and kept expecting that now he would get up, stretch, and invite her to a tea party in the house or in the gazebo entwined with grapes. However, no miracle happened. Her services, which arrived in response to a call from a neighbor, began another whirlwind of sad affairs associated with the passing of the older generation. The lady doctor confirmed the death of my grandfather, presumably from a heart attack. She recommended funeral agencies to the girl and explained that there were specialists working there who could organize mourning procedures with the most due respect for the deceased and sympathy for his relatives. Helen listened to the advice and tried with all her might to hold back bitter tears of despair. Only by lunchtime the girl was left alone. Helen entered her grandfather's house and burst into tears when she saw the phone on the table, which he apparently forgot on his last earthly morning. Probably if he had a cell phone, he would be able to call somewhere and ask for help, but it was impossible to change the past. Everything turned out the way it did. The girl discovered the cash, which her grandfather George and grandmother Kristen told her about shortly after she came of age. The man then tilted the rug hanging over the bed, gently pressed on one of the wooden panels, then with a slight movement moved it to the side. The surprised girl saw a deep vertical niche. Grandfather explained, "Here, granddaughter, Speta and I are slowly putting money here so that it won't be a burden to anyone. You'll bury us with this money." Helen remembered how she began to grumble at her grandparents. She said that it was too early for them to think about such a topic. She assured that they would still have the opportunity to babysit their great-grandchildren. "No, my dear, that won't do. First, I will have to consider approve, and then help raise the kids. Mom and Dad always have no time." Granny, patting her smiling granddaughter on the head, quietly objected. "Helen, we're not asking you whether it's too early for us to think about our last journey in this world or not. Just showing you so you know, just in case. After all, George already has an anniversary this year, 70 years old, and I'm not much younger. Alas, at that age anything can happen. Your parents, of course, also know about this hiding place. But you never know, maybe they'll be wary or start being modest." Grandfather George supported his wife. "Now, we don't want to be a burden to you. So let's end the conversation." The grandmother hastened to change the topic and began to talk about the amusements of the selected kitten, simply nicknamed the man. Now, 6 years after this conversation, the skinny kid has turned into a well-fed, long, and independent, handsome man. The owner's departure was a real shock for the animal, and he even lost his excellent appetite for several days. However, grandfather George managed to pull the cat out of this state, and now this mission fell to Helen. It seemed to the girl that the orphan cat understood everything, and that's why he curled up on his grandfather's bed and didn't even react to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. The agencies recommended by our employee were indeed professional. A serious man suggested that Helen hold a farewell not at home, but in a special ritual hall at the cemetery. Getting there is much easier than here in the private sector, and even though the house is big, there will still be fuss, unnecessary fuss. The room there is convenient and comfortable. Everyone will be able to say goodbye calmly and without the crush that usually accompanies the removal of a body from an apartment or house. Everything will be both touching and civilized. Besides, understand, it will save you a lot of problems. The offer seemed reasonable to Helen, but she had to spend not only her meager savings but also her grandfather's stash to pay for funeral services. The girl did everything that was necessary. As if being in a state of sleep, she kept waiting for her parents to arrive, or at least answer the email, but in vain. The girl contacted the hotel where they had booked a room, but as we managed to understand from the answer in broken Russian, Mr. and Mrs. Hurd did not move in. They explained that they had decided to change plans a little. Helen was worried about her parents, but she couldn't do anything. Now clods of earth began to fall on the lid of grandfather George's coffin, but neither his son nor his daughter-in-law appeared. Words of condolences and sympathy were received by Helen, who had to listen to the lamentations of distant relatives who came to see the old man off on his last journey. Some spoke bluntly about the thoughtless son and daughter-in-law who did not appear at the mournful event. The girl defended her parents as best she could, and the guardians of other people's morality fell silent for a while, turning the conversation to other topics. Gradually, only relatives and closest neighbors remained at the funeral table, organized in a small cafe. Helen, who last saw most of them a little less than a year ago at farewell to grandmother Sveta, could hardly endure all the questions. She wanted to run away from the cafe as soon as possible, but she had to fulfill her granddaughter's duty to the very end. From time to time, she herself, along with the waiters, took out dirty dishes and brought funeral treats, just so as not to sit at the table listening to the conversations of those gathered growing louder. Quite by chance, Helen, while serving another portion of pies, overheard part of the conversation between Aunt Valia and grandfather's cousin Stepan. George sometimes communicated with this apple tree like a person. I told him, even when Kristen was alive, that this useless tree needs to be cut down. It has long grown higher than the roof of the house, and apples cannot be easily obtained. Kristen, kingdom of heaven. She kept swearing that this tree was of little use. It would bear fruit for a year so that you were tired of growing the harvest. Then it wouldn't bear a single fruit. Everything was threatened to be cut down. Only George, blessed to his memory, always stood up to defend the apple tree, nodding, and Julia agreed with the interlocutor. What you say is true. George's passion for this old apple tree also seems strange to me. Well, if only the plot was about a hectare, then it would seem that the place wouldn't be a problem. But it's simply stupid to leave such a huge tree in such a small snippet of conversation, made Helen think. Indeed, in fact, grandfather treated this apple tree as if it were a living person. The girl often saw him affectionately stroking the bark of a tree as he passed by. Once as a child, Helen, deciding to play, climbed onto a branch, which broke off under her. And grandfather George, entrusting his granddaughter to the care of his wife, began to treat the wound of the tree himself, recently. After the death of grandmother Kristen, my grandfather even preferred to relax alone under the crown of an apple tree, rather than in a specially built gazebo entwined with grapes. Thoughts from the mysterious apple tree that George had so highlighted briefly receded to sad worries. The relatives were the last to leave the rented hall, and Stepan reminded Helen, no, someone should definitely spend the night in George's house until 40. You won't be scared alone until your parents show up. Maybe send someone with you. At least take Mylena, my youngest daughter, with you. She has nothing to do at home anyway. Her husband is on a business trip. You can sit and chat. Looking at her, she saw the face of a woman who clearly had her own plans for the evening and completely lacked the desire to spend the night somewhere in an unfamiliar place. Helen hastened to refuse. But thank you, but I really can handle it myself. After all, it's like a sign of my respect for my grandfather. Having said goodbye to everyone, the girl hurried to the public transport stop, since her relatives had to go in completely different directions. As soon as Helen opened the gate of her grandfather's house, she regretted that she had tried to create the image of an independent and strong person. Of course, she's not too young to be afraid of an empty house. But I've already spent several nights here completely alone, so he can handle it. She began to think again about the reason why the tree occupied such an important place in the life of her relative. Thoughtfully, the girl hand-fed the sad cat, but she felt somehow uneasy being in the house, even in the company of a cat. Helen went out into the yard and, obeying an impulse, approached a tree on which small green fruits were hanging high somewhere. A flock of goosebumps ran down her spine when the girl saw scratches on the ground. There was no doubt. Grandfather George left these marks. It became truly creepy when Helen had the crazy idea that the dying man was scratching the ground not in agony but trying to dig something up. The girl went to the barn, took a small garden trowel from there, and returning to the apple tree, began to carefully dig the ground. Almost immediately, the scoop hit something hard. Helen began to dig with the utmost care and soon pulled out from a shallow hole a solid rectangular package, wrapped in a bag and additionally wrapped with tape. Helen had never heard any stories about family heirlooms and was truly shocked. At home, Helen laid an old towel on the table, which had long been asking for a well-deserved rest somewhere in the trash, put her find on it, and carefully opened the package with a kitchen knife, which grandfather always kept sharp. Under the layers of tape in the bag was a metal candy box. The girl, holding her breath, opened it and saw inside not jewelry or money but papers. Under the folded notebook leaves, clearly covered with grandmother's even handwriting, there were envelopes. Judging by the fact that the package was quite modern, with the emblem of a chain supermarket, and the paper was neither damp nor yellowed, Helen concluded that the find had not lain in the ground for very long. thinking that nothing bad would happen if she found out what her grandfather was trying to get before his death. Helen began to study the find. It was clearly written by my grandmother. "My dear George, I'm writing you a note, realizing that I have very little time left in this world, and I don't think I have the right to take this secret with me. Forgive me, George, for many years ago, because of love for you, I committed deception and even a crime. It's hard to admit, but it's necessary. You and I were already married then. They sent my daughter to kindergarten, and I returned to work at the post office. Everything was fine with us, so I envied myself. And then I saw a letter addressed to you. The sender was a certain woman. My heart immediately felt bad. I didn't give you the letter. I secretly read it myself. That's how I found out about your novel. Your sweetheart reported that it was her strict father who arranged your separation back in 1964. He threatened to kill you or put you in jail using his connections. In fact, he left her the only way, to tell you, looking into your eyes, that he doesn't love you at all and doesn't want to see you ever again. The mother tried to stand up for her daughter, but it did not help. The woman was simply beaten by her own husband because she dared to say a word in defiance. I looked at what your father had done and was terribly afraid for you. That's why she said convincingly everything she was told. After this cruel confession, you predictably flared up, packed your things, took an apple tree seedling as a souvenir for your parents and returned. The sensible woman in the letter reported that she was pregnant with your child, and to cover up her sin, she was married off without an official signature to some widower with numerous children in a remote settlement that didn't even have a name. I read the letter in the dark, wet with tears, and even began to sympathize with your young beloved. She complained that her family life did not work out. The man with whom she had to live perceived her as a servant. But despite the scandals with relatives, Alina named the girl she was born your daughter in honor of her mother Sophie. The unfortunate young mother found herself literally in slavery. She endured beatings, humiliation, and tirelessly planned her escape. When my daughter began to grow up, Alien became even heavier. The native children of this so-called husband began to mock the girl, and her mother could not say a word in defense. The beatings began immediately. Only 5 years later, Alien still managed to escape from her husband. She did not give details, but because even the letters at this point were blurred from tears spilled on the paper, it was clear it was very difficult. Alien asked that you come to these very settlements for her and her daughter. She wrote that she would be waiting for you. When I read the letter, it was as if I had gone blind and deaf at the same time. I really didn't understand how I should continue to live. Giving you the messages meant losing my family, and our son was only 3 years old. How could I deprive his father with my own hands? How would he grow up without you? I repent. That first letter, I then destroyed it and threw it in the oven. I thought I protected my family. I shouldn't have hoped. Alien continued to send letters. The next one came almost a year later. Apparently, she planned for you to receive news from her and your daughter on your birthday. She asked why you don't answer her. How scared I was then that she would get ready and come to you. The distance is not particularly long, maybe a little more than 300 kilometers or something like that. It turns out that almost next door to us live those who are capable of destroying my life. If I can burn the letters, then the problem with Sophie is more complicated. What am I supposed to do with the woman and child? I started thinking about how I could prevent them from coming to you. I wrote a letter copying your handwriting on your behalf just in case. I promised that I would come as soon as I could. You probably don't even remember how I tried to persuade you to move, but you never agreed. So I lived like on a volcano. I didn't know how to protect my happiness, how to preserve it if you found out the truth about yours. At work, I also didn't take any vacation or sick leave because of this. Then you realized, 5 years later, that only once a year does this woman bother you. I felt a little better. I burned the letters for a long time, several years, and then I felt ashamed. I started hiding them. I knew that there were places in the house that you would never think of getting into. The only thing is, because of my own fears, I couldn't leave my post office and refuse the more promising position. Well, it's okay, I'm used to it. How long did she write to you? But I only saved 10 messages with the last letter that arrived in 1994, and I acted completely meanly. And that she wrote that her health had become completely bad and that she needed medication. And although Sophie tries to support her, there's always not enough money. It's clear. It was such a time then, the whole country was in a fever. She didn't ask for anything for herself. But, of course, I couldn't completely calm down. What if the difficult one brings her to our region? What if she decides to see you? I carefully printed this envelope and returned it with the note the addressee has left. After that, the stream of letters from Alien completely dried up. Why should I have done this before? And I don't understand it myself. There wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And now I don't know what to do with the letters. By right and conscience, you should read them, but not during my lifetime. So, when you find out the bitter story of Ali and your daughter, I will no longer be there. Sorry for being selfish, but I couldn't do otherwise. She loved you too much and didn't want to leave her son without a father. Now I don't care anymore. Gina has also grown up a long time ago, and his granddaughter is a bride. So the path to Alien is clear. I only ask you one thing. Wait at least a year after I leave before looking for your first love and daughter, whom you have never seen. Maintain this period of mourning in honor of all the good things that happened between us. And then do as your heart tells you. Forgive me for everything. Loving you, Kristen. Helen was shocked when she read the note. The story of tragic love, many years of deception, and difficult confession involuntarily touched her. The girl thought that probably Kristen's grandmother should have kept her secret forever. On the other hand, she understood that this was too cowardly. Of course, it's easier to judge from the outside than to find yourself in such a stalemate. And Helen couldn't imagine what she would have done in her grandmother's place. Would you immediately tell your legal husband that his friend still loves him and is waiting for him, together with their common daughter, or would you try by any means within your imagination to protect him from this literally stunning information? It became clear to Helen what Grandpa George wanted to talk to her about. Surely, since the one-year reprieve that Grandmother Kristen asked him for was coming to an end, he wanted to get advice on how to find his old lover. After all, a lot of time has passed, and it is possible that this alien has long since changed the common surname Smith. Her daughter, Helen's blood sister and her father's daughter, could also probably be married. Trying to distract myself from the unexpected information received, Helen put the papers back into the box, put it in the closet, and began reading the letters that Alien had sent to her grandfather. You never know what other details of the personal life of a loved one will be revealed. So alone, except for the cat, she fell into a light sleep. It was boring, and Helen started cleaning, although there was no particular need for this. The girl took out a bucket of dirty water to throw it into the far corner of the site and saw a car drive up to the gate. Helen's parents, who had finally returned from abroad, got out of the car and she was incredibly happy. Even though this meeting was tinged with bitterness, at least the worry for the parents receded from the heart. During the confused conversation, it turned out that they had arrived in a place where there was no connection or access to the internet. Michael and Anne, having reached civilization, received a sad message from their daughter just before the funeral of Grandfather George and hurried to return, but were still late. Helen was glad that she now had the support she needed so much. After hugs and tears, when everyone was already sitting at the table, the girl began to tell her dad and mom about the unusual find. To prove her words, the girl took out a box from the closet together with her parents. She once again read aloud Grandma Kristen's handwritten confession, and then they studied the surviving letters. One of them contained a photo from a photo studio. It depicted two pretty girls, and there was clearly a kinship in the appearance of the beauties, but they looked more like sisters with a not very big age difference. However, the inscription on the back of the photograph indicated that this was the first love of Grandfather George and their common daughter Sophie. In beautiful handwriting it was written, "In memory of my beloved George from Alien and Sophie on her 16th birthday. We look forward to meeting you. 1981. Michael, forgetting about his respectability, even whistled, "Yes." To say that I'm surprised is to say nothing at all. How did Mom manage to keep all this a secret for so many years and not give away her knowledge? I can't even imagine. Anne, who had a wonderful relationship with her calm mother-in-law, contrary to all stereotypes and ideas about the peculiarities of the family way of life, was also perplexed. They had so many heart-to-heart conversations, but Kristen never said a word that somewhere far away her official husband had a beloved and illegitimate daughter. It was not easy to come to terms with such news. Anne asked, "Do you think we should find your sister and her mother, if she's still alive, of course, or let everything remain as it is?" The man himself did not know how to react to what was happening. Judging by what he learned from his daughter, the father wanted the secret of his youth to be known. On the other hand, is it ethical now to intrude into the fate of a stranger, but a woman related by blood? She appears to be about 50 years old now, and this same alien is most likely now approaching 70. A reminder of her difficult youth and the man she once loved so much but never got to see could be harmful to her health. In addition, as Kristen's grandmother wrote, after she sent back the letter marked the addressee has dropped out, they stopped coming at all. This could mean that alien believed the lie or that she was desperate. However, alas, the most unfavorable events in the fate of the woman and her daughter could have happened, Karen said, as if voicing her thoughts out loud. But still, it seems to me that we should at least try to find my grandfather's daughter just to somehow rehabilitate him. After all, it's not Grandpa George's fault that everything turned out this way. I think it would be fair if the whole truth became known to Alien, and of course Sophie. Listen, Dad. The girl turned to Michael. How do you feel knowing that you have an older blood sister? Do you want to see her and chat? The man was confused and asked his daughter in response. And you, Helen, this is Sophie. Actually, Auntie, that's what you have to do. It turns out that it's interesting to meet her. Helen listened to herself and admitted, curious and a little scary. Opinions in the family were divided. Anne, after listening to her husband and daughter, said, "It seems to me that we should leave everything as it is. There is no need now to disturb something that has long been forgotten. More than half a century has passed. Maybe this alien is happy with another person. And hello, meet, so to speak, relatives." I think this is not entirely correct. A long conversation did not help find a compromise. In addition, all family members themselves were not sure of the correctness of their thoughts. As a result, the father went to bed in order to visit the place of George's final resting place in the morning. "Sorry, Dad, I'm late," Michael whispered, standing by a fresh mound covered with wreaths. "I never could have imagined that we wouldn't see each other again." The man put 4 scarlet carnations on the empty space and bowed his head, hiding his tears. After Michael, flowers were laid on George's grave by his daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Each of the grieving relatives realized that they were subconsciously waiting for a sign on how to deal with the information that had fallen on them. They didn't talk about it out loud, but Michael, Anne, and Helen were waiting for a revelation to descend on them. Perhaps it was naive and stupid, but I would really like to know what George himself wanted. No matter how much they hoped for a clue, they could not get it, and with a heavy heart, they returned to the apartment. We decided that Michael would live in the house for now, and that his wife and daughter would come to him in their free time. While Anne helped her husband pack at least the minimum necessary things, Helen hurried to the nearest store to buy some special food that was tastier for the yearning cat. The girl felt very sorry for the cat, who seemed to have suddenly lost his luster and lost his previously excellent appetite. After consulting with a serious-looking woman who was busily putting bags of wet food into the cart, Helen collected some gifts for her grandfather's pet and returned home, handing her dad a bag of food. "My dear, I'll ask. He is now a little capricious and may refuse food. Try to feed him from the palm of your hand. He usually starts eating as a sign of respect." He smiled at his daughter. "No, don't worry. I won't offend the tailed one. The days flew by. Just keep up with them." Helen, her mother, went to work, and in the evenings they talked about everything, as the girls were accustomed to from early childhood. Of course, they also talked about the secret that Grandma Kristen had been hiding for. We decided to gather our relatives. We sat together mentally, remembering various incidents from the past. Michael carefully tried to beg it from his great-uncle. "Stepan, can you tell us anything about Dad's youth?" The older man was happy to talk. George was always brave for any good cause, responsive and decisive. When he returned from the army, he went to the factory to get a job in the personnel department. As his mother later said, he heard from someone that young people from our city were sent to build villages and do household work. It was no longer a new thing then. Everyone in the country wanted to help. The people acted in unison. So George, after returning from military service, decided that he would be more useful there. I admit, I also wanted to go with him, but where should I go? In total at that time, I was 15 years old. George is 5 years older than me. In general, he went far. Fortunately, in the Army, he learned to drive a truck and received a license. He returned almost 5 years later. I brought saplings, as if as a souvenir of my long business trip. Of course, he has changed during this time. A naive boy left, but an almost grown man returned. Not because I'm related, but to be fair, I'll say that George definitely hasn't become any worse. I think she can find such Sophie now. His hands are golden and his character is worthy. When here at the automobile plant, they accepted him with open arms. Teetotal, hardworking, honest. What more could you ask for? Hungry for work, and so he will take off his last shirt and give it to someone else. Oh, and the men respected him. No matter what, he never refused. Well, women generally died for him, and he treated everyone very respectfully. Then he married Kristen. She worked at the post office, and somehow the company car broke down, and George was driving by and couldn't leave his fellow driver in trouble. That's how we met. We met briefly and signed, and see, my mother was even offended. It seemed like the holiday was squeezed. But since you, Gina, were born, George was happy. Here in the yard, relatives, neighbors, and colleagues staged a big party. Everyone was invited. It seemed like there weren't any delicacies on the table, but come on, that's not the main thing. It turns out that the atmosphere is much more important. Yes, there was a time when all the neighbors lived almost like relatives. Stefan Alexandrovich interrupted his memories to quench his thirst with a cool, tasty compote. And although he didn't manage to learn anything new that his son didn't know, it was still nice to hear kind words addressed to George. After only Michael, Anne, and Helen remained in the house, the female part of the family cleaned up, leaving the only man, apart from the cat, to dismantle the makeshift benches. Helen went to bed on her favorite cot, and she had a strange, incredibly realistic dream. The girl was not even afraid when she saw Grandfather George at his favorite apple tree. The man stood under the tree, gently stroking the bark and looking at his granddaughter, asking, "When the apples ripen, take a few and give them to those you know. Don't forget, Helen. Please don't forget." Grandfather George looked somewhere, just trying to see what was happening behind his granddaughter's shoulder. Helen turned to see what or who interested the man, but it was empty. When the girl's gaze returned to the apple tree, Grandfather was no longer under the canopy. Outside the window, birds whistled and sang, tearing Helen out of the captivity of sleep, which left behind a vivid impression. There were no doubts left. Grandfather George conveyed the news, the very sign that was so missing to make the right decision. Of course, he made his desire clear. At his request, Kristen Helen must go on a trip in the fall so that her grandfather's longtime beloved and their common daughter will find out the whole truth. Shocked, Helen did not hide from her parents that she saw Grandfather George in a dream. Michael was even a little annoyed that the late father in his dreams visited not him, but his granddaughter. But wise Anne supported both her husband and daughter, so it was necessary. There, beyond reality, there are probably its own rules. In anticipation of the holiday, the whole family began preparing for Helen's upcoming trip. The girl's attempts to find Enya and Sophie on social networks were unsuccessful, although she patiently looked through hundreds of pages of users from various regions, and not just from that area. Helen planned to hit the road on the first day of her vacation, so as not to delay the resolution of the issue, which had already been postponed for many years by the will of Kristen's grandmother. The girl's parents, trying not to show their excitement, helped their daughter get ready. They reacted most responsibly to the upcoming transportation of apples, which Grandfather ordered to take with and placed a rectangular basket without a handle in a rather compact but roomy sports bag. She carefully placed the ripe fruits there, laying each layer with parchment paper on her husband's advice, and the main load, carefully covered with a towel, was packed. Helen added the minimum amount of things to her bag and hit the road. At the girl's request, her parents only accompanied her to the taxi, and although the daughter promised to call and report the results of the search, Anne and Michael were worried about their daughter. It is not at all a fact that the search expedition will be successful, and a meeting with a woman from George Ilyach's past could lead to completely unpredictable results. Thanks to a carefully thought-out route and the absence of any unforeseen circumstances, Helen easily reached the village from where Grandfather George had been receiving letters for so long, some of which he was able to read only after his wife's death. The local villages seemed to the girl to be quite a cozy settlement. The coming autumn had already touched the trees with gold and made the village especially picturesque. Private houses coexisted peacefully with apartment buildings, near which in some places there were small vegetable gardens and even greenhouses. The girl approached the house, the address of which was indicated on the envelope. An intercom was installed on the entrance door of a typical 5-story building, and Helen froze for a few seconds in indecision. Although she was preparing mentally for the trip and even diligently prepared a short speech before the difficult explanation, suddenly became scared. Having overcome herself, Helen typed the number of the apartment she was interested in on the keyboard. Hearing a pleasant female voice from the speakers of the device, the girl asked, he shuddered. "Hello, excuse me, please. Can I talk to Alien and her daughter Sophie? Come in." It came from the speaker, and the door opened. Helen was very surprised that the stranger, whose voice sounded from the speakers, did not ask her either her name or the purpose of meeting her. But there was no time to think. Breathing deeply to calm down, the girl went up to the second floor she needed, where a not-quite-old woman was already waiting for her behind the open door. Helen peered into her face, but in vain. I tried to recognize the stranger Sophie. How, given the fact that in the photograph she was captured at the height of her young 16 years and more than 3 decades had passed, it was unlikely that such drastic changes could have occurred. Outwardly, the woman was of a completely different type, and she looked at most about 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Is it possible to accurately determine age by the appearance of modern women who take care of themselves, to which the stranger undoubtedly belonged? Helen greeted warmly. "Hello again. I was the one who bothered you. Tell me, please, how can I talk to Alien and Sophie?" The woman conducted the conversation freely, even in a brotherly way, as if she had known Helen for many years. Hello, if you're not joking. From what regions did you come? The question surprised Helen, but she answered honestly, although she did not understand why it mattered. The woman, hearing the name of the city, softened and invited her to enter the apartment, where she asked another strange question. "What are your grandfather's last names?" "My grandfather's last name on my father's side is Johnson, and on my mother's side, Adrian." The uttered phrase had a strange effect on the woman. She didn't ask any more questions. She began to fuss. Despite Helen's excuses, she led her into the kitchen through her plate of delicious rosy pies. She offered tea, coffee, homemade compote, and, holding out a glass of sweet drink to the guests, my mom's best friend was Sophie. She was like a caring nanny and an older sister to me. They survived together even when there was nothing special to eat except potatoes grown in a vacant lot. Meat was seen occasionally, but Alien, as she was planting, was so worried and afraid, and she hoped that one day they would look for her. I firmly told my mother not to tell anyone how to find her and her daughter, except for the man with the last name Johnson or his descendants. She was deeply in love with a certain George Johnson. The daughter is the fruit of their sinful and sweet love. Yes, that's right, George Johnson, my grandfather. Helen confirmed her comment. He passed away recently. Only after this did it become clear that his first love and their common daughter once lived here in your apartment at this very address. It's not Grandpa George's fault that he didn't find them earlier. This is how the circumstances developed. The landlady took a notebook from the closet, tore out a piece of paper, took a pen and flipped through the pages. I began to rewrite something, not forgetting to show cordiality. "You eat, drink. Perhaps you rushed here straight from the station. Refresh yourself. Otherwise, in order to meet Alien or daughter to meet again on the road, you will have to go to another city." They moved. We had to, although it was incredibly difficult for us to part. They became almost family. But after Aunt Alien encountered an acquaintance of the man who kept her as a slave, she was afraid to stay here. It's easier to get lost in a big city. Here you go. I texted you their address and Sophie's phone number to arrange a meeting. Knowing Aunt Alien, I am sure that she is still waiting for news about her beloved. But it's better if you and Sophie discuss the time and place of the meeting. Things aren't going well in their house. My daughter got an extremely nasty husband. When I saw him for the first time, can you imagine? I was even scared. It seems like a person is standing, smiling at you, and his eyes are contemptuous and angry. As my aunt later told me, he helped my daughter a lot in some way when she got a new job in the city, and she fell in love without noticing any of his shortcomings. When I saw it, it was too late, like a fly caught in a web. No matter how hard his aunt tries to get him away from his daughter, it just doesn't work. Lessons, the woman fell silent. Apparently, she herself was worried about this situation, but she did not know how to help the woman whom she considered practically her sister. Helen tried not to look like she was from a hungry region, but she was also unable to refuse the tasty treat and belatedly remembered the rules of etiquette. "Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Helen. My name is." "Thank you very much. Your pies are very tasty and the compote is simply wonderful." The woman was very cutely embarrassed. Me, come on. It's me who attacked with interrogation. My name is Alice. By the way, an alien taught me to cook. She is generally a master at cooking. Listen, Helen, do you have money for the trip? A taxi will cost more, but it will be faster than taking a train. Sorry, it's not much, but I can give you $50. Helen was deeply shocked by this proposal. Some Alice seems to be a completely modern young woman in her simple-minded and open behavior, like good characters from old films that grandparents loved to watch. Such a friendly attitude brought tears to Helen's eyes, and she hastened to calm Alice down. Don't worry, my finances are fine. Thank you, Alice. I'm very glad to meet you. Thank you for the treat. It's time to move on. Helen looked at the cost of a taxi to her destination in the app and sighed. Yes, you're right. The price tag is something incredible. It doesn't matter. I'd love to take a ride on the train. Alice didn't let her guess go so easily. Mate. Now we'll look at the schedule of electric trains and passing trains on the internet. Maybe we'll even book a ticket right away. Why are you toiling around in the waiting room in vain? It's better to keep me company here. It's true. Helen nodded, agreeing with Alice's wisdom. But the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. It turned out that given the time it takes to get to the station, you almost have to say goodbye to the hospitable woman. Almost leaving the apartment, Helen hesitated for a while. Opening the bag, she took out several large fragrant apples and handed them to Alice. Here, these are apples from my grandfather's orchard. They are very tasty. I don't know how else to thank you for such a warm welcome. Alice was embarrassed again, but accepted the apples. I can't resist such an incredible aroma and beauty. They are just like the picture. Say hi to Sophie. By the way, I'll probably, with your permission, warn her that you're going to see them. Let her somehow prepare an Oya. Otherwise, you never know, the blood pressure will jump, the heart will catch, or something else. Helen had no objections, and having said a warm goodbye to her new friend, the girl went to the station. Already with the sound of wheels, she sent her parents a detailed story about how the responsive Alice greeted her. She said that Alien and Sophie had moved, but she had their new address. The mother, who was clearly worried about her daughter, responded almost instantly and asked her to be careful on the road. The girl with a light heart promised to look around carefully and not get involved in any dubious adventures. Fortunately, the situation in the carriage was quite calm. Someone peered thoughtfully at the landscape outside the window, becoming less and less visible due to the approaching darkness. Some of the random fellow passengers were dozing, and Helen regretted that she could not, like most passengers in the carriage, immerse herself in communication with a smartphone. The charge level forced me to refrain from this luxury. Almost at the moment when the previous day crossed the border of night to remain forever in the past, Helen found herself in an ancient town standing on the... The girl thought with belated regret that she had not thought to book a hotel room in advance, because showing up at a stranger's apartment at such a late time was somehow completely awkward. The girl felt a little uneasy, but ordering herself not to be a coward, she quickly figured out how to get to the nearest hotel before her smartphone was completely discharged. Luck was with Helen. The administrator, smiling, even seemed to sincerely offer a small, but, in her words, a very cozy room. Soon Helen settled into her temporary housing and, having put her smartphone on charge, took a shower, had dinner, and lay down on the... Although it was late, the mattress was comfortable. No loud sounds penetrated the hotel room, and there was no sleep in either eye. Still, there is a meeting in the morning, for which she went on a trip, and the anxiety appeared again. The girl was thinking for the 100th time about what to say to the innocent victim of deception and how to apologize for her grandmother, and in general, in what style to conduct the conversation. After all, if, with the good-natured Alice, everything somehow turned out very naturally, this does not mean that communication with Ale and Sophie will be just as pleasant. Although she managed to fall asleep only in the morning, Helen woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock, thanks to the girl's youth. The anxious night did not leave any noticeable marks on her appearance, and at 10, she decided to call Sophie. The woman answered almost instantly. It seemed as if she was expecting this call. It is quite likely that this was the case. After all, it's not very often that there are such meetings of relatives who had no idea about each other. Having quickly agreed to meet in one of the cafes located near the hotel, Sophie was the first to end the conversation. Surprisingly, the choice of a neutral public place for the meeting finally calmed Helen, for whom her recent acquaintance with Alice made the most pleasant and even encouraging impression. Well, such a sweet, kind woman simply cannot be friends and consider bad Sophie her family. This means that they are at least quite adequate. In addition, in a cafe surrounded by Sophie, she is unlikely to reach a violent expression of emotions, and there is less risk that Alien will get too nervous. The girl transferred the basket of apples into a spacious shopping bag, which she had prudently taken with her, and went to the meeting. As Helen approached the cafe, she noticed a slender woman on the porch of the establishment, in whose features it was quite possible to see the girl from the photograph from the letter. The girl was the first to say hello and introduce herself. "Hey, hello, Sophie. I'm Helen Johnson. It turns out that my grandfather is your dad," the woman smiled. "Very nice. I tell you quite sincerely, Alice told me that she had wonderful impressions of communication, and her opinion, as life has shown, must be trusted. But let's go. I'll introduce you to Mom, and we'll talk calmly. She's waiting for us inside." The acquaintance procedure turned out to be unusually calm. Alien behaved affably, but with poorly concealed interest, peering into the face of the granddaughter of her beloved man. To somehow break the prolonged silence, Helen handed the woman a bag. "Here, these are apples from your grandfather's orchard." Alien looked up from studying her face and, looking inside the bag, gasped, "No." The woman carefully took out one fruit, looking at it, holding it tenderly, as if the apple were a living creature, and, without addressing either Helen or her daughter, she spoke quietly. It was noticeable that she wanted to express all the accumulated pain. "George and I once dreamed that we would live in a house near which an apple tree would definitely grow. Not just like a fruit tree, but also seemingly in honor of me. What a pity that our dreams did not come true. When we met, I was only 15 years old. However, in my native land, all girls grow up early, mature for family life with a loved one. George was 9 years older. This age difference did not bother me at all. I deceived him. She said that they were already adults, and he couldn't even think that I was lying. We loved each other, forgetting about everything in the world. Probably as punishment for my lies and this sin, higher powers forced me to. Moreover, this terrible punishment also affects my daughter." The woman stroked the hand of her daughter sitting next to her, who blushed like boiled crayfish and fell silent. Helen, listening and without interrupting, "It's not at all that higher powers intervened in your life. Everything is much simpler and more offensive. Grandfather George, I received some of your letters only after the death of my wife, my grandmother." Helen told in detail everything she knew, and, not forgetting to mention her strange dream. "Someday, mate, so I came here so that you know everything. Both my parents and I thought it would be fair. I'm very sorry that your love had such a tragic story, but now nothing can be fixed." Alien held an apple in one hand, pressing it to her heart with her palm, and with the other she wiped away the tears that stubbornly rolled down her cheeks. Neither Sophie nor Helen knew what to say or how to calm the woman in this grief. The silence was like an unspoken minute of silence over George's death. "They haven't ordered drinks or food yet." Alien, as if waking up from a daze, suggested, "My dears, maybe we can walk along the street. I'm missing some air." Helen and Sophie agreed without hesitation, although the waiter, who did not wait for the order or at least a tip, simply looked unhappy. Nobody cared about him. 3 representatives of the fair sex reflected on the vicissitudes of fate and how outside interference destroys the most wonderful dreams. My daughter wanted to take the bag of apples, but Alien stopped her. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to part with these apples." Fortunately, the long handles made it possible to hang the bag on your shoulder, so it wasn't too heavy to carry. Alien asked Helen to tell everything she knew about her grandfather. What kind of work he did, what programs he liked to watch, what he liked to eat, and other everyday little things. The woman seemed to absorb the moments that had passed her by and smiled quietly. Perhaps she imagined that she herself had lived next to him all these years. The almost idyllic walk was interrupted by the ringtone of Sophie's mobile phone. The man who called shouted so loudly that even at a distance of the alley, Helen heard everything he said. "No, why the hell aren't you at home or at work? I was in a hurry on purpose, driving like crazy. And everything is like in a bad joke. Where are you going? Look, if I find out that you're cheating on me, I'll kill everyone, and you and your mother will fly out of my apartment like little kids." Stately Sophie, listening to the tirade, seemed to become smaller in stature. The lights in her eyes went out, and she answered briefly, "I'll be there now." Alien became noticeably agitated. It seems that the voice of the man who called was well known to her, and this man did not evoke the slightest positive emotions in her. Sophie began to say goodbye to Helen and then turned to her mother. "Listen, I'll run. Boris seems to be on edge already, and you can talk some more. You probably would like to talk about a lot of things." She hurried to leave, and from that moment, the casual conversation seemed to evaporate. The girl understood. The woman was terribly afraid for her daughter, who, as it was easy to understand, was in a relationship with a real tyrant. Soon Alien confirmed the guess of her young companion. I have the impression that my bitter story of slavery and the power of a cruel, domineering man is now being continued by my daughter. She, however, got married, unlike me, quite officially, and even out of great love. That's how it seemed at least 15 years ago. I was so happy for my daughter. Boris always treated me, and even more so her, with respect. But as soon as he managed to persuade me to add my savings to a shared apartment, the relationship began to deteriorate instantly, gradually. One thing didn't suit him, then another. While I was huddled separately in a rented room, separate from my daughter and son-in-law, I had no idea how everything really was. Then, 5 years ago, I became seriously ill and went on long sick leave. In general, I had to ask Boris to come to their 2-room apartment. It seems that I felt that I had the moral right to do this, but, of course, I felt uneasy. Nothing. She hid her pride somewhere far away and asked to stay with her daughter and Boris. Then I saw that not everything was fine with them. There are always some complaints against my daughter, jealousy, hurtful words. In a milder version than before, the monster oppressed me, but every reproach against Sophie was a punishment for me. Recently, he began to accuse me of infertility, although he himself always repeated that children were not included in his life plans. I get the impression that he is provoking Sophie to divorce, and then when we exchange the apartment, we will get some kind of closet. I now clearly understand that Boris will share everything thoroughly down to every spoon, and that she and I are like 2 blades of grass that can be broken like spitting. I have no legal education. Sophie is also far from this. We cannot afford a good lawyer financially. Helen did not know how to console the unhappy woman who had never in her life been able to lean on a reliable man's shoulder. Instead of rushing into battle with all the troubles yourself, it seems that friendship with Alice's mother is the only bright spot in her life, even if it was not easy. But when no one tries to solve the problems, it is at least morally easier. As soon as I lost my permanent job and started baking at home, the fragile balance collapsed. Somehow everything went downhill. Although the standard of living even seemed to become higher, I can probably pay for my rented apartment again. But here's the irony of fate. I simply began to fear for my daughter's health. How afraid I am that Boris will start raising his hand against Sophie. And now there's something uneasy in my heart, as if some kind of trouble is approaching. Helen, I don't want to involve you in our family squabbles, but come to us, please. With you. Boris should moderate his ambition. He always does this in the presence of strangers, enthusiastically and even selflessly. Plays the role of an exemplary husband. If you ask our neighbors, everyone will probably unanimously say that my Sophie is incredibly lucky to have him. Helen immediately agreed to join us. Soon, after traveling a few bus stops and walking a little along the street, they found themselves inside the apartment. A muffled male voice was heard from one of the rooms. "Now I'll teach you how to greet your husband, because in such fools as you need to put the thought into not wagging your tail in the absence of your legal spouse." Alien opened the door and saw Boris grab Sophie by the neck, lifting her off the floor. In a state of some kind of irrational anger, the woman took the bag of apples from her shoulder and hit her son-in-law on the head with it. The man, having let go of his victim, as if knocked down, collapsed on the floor, freezed from coughing. "Mom, what are you doing? What fly bit you? What if you broke Boreas' skull?" Len slowly walked up to the sofa, sat down on it, and asked, "Sophie, nothing will happen to Boris. Better bring me some water with a sedative. My heart is starting to pound." Helen, meanwhile, looked closely at the man. He was clearly not too stunned and was already trying to get up. She looked dumbfounded. Boris was in no hurry to get up, and, rubbing the back of his head, angrily collapsed on Alien and began to threaten. "Don't even think that this will be in vain. I'll go and film the beatings at the emergency room and put you, the senile old woman, behind bars." Sophie's hand shook as she handed the cup of medicine to her mother. The woman began to persuade Boris not to get excited, but he only became more unruly and uttered threats. "You'll go and eat gruel until you die, and then you'll die in a government house. And with your health, there's no point in being there. Unexpectedly, Boris's tirade was interrupted by Helen, who unwillingly, along with her grandfather and father, watched a variety of detective series and had, albeit small, but valuable experience in calming down even the most inappropriate office visitors and presumptuous suppliers. First of all, I'll call the police here right now. I saw with my own eyes how you tried to harm Sophie. So Alien's actions may well qualify as causing grievous bodily harm in self-defense, but you may have much more serious problems. Believe me. Helen herself could not understand how she had the audacity to tell an adult man some numbers of articles of the criminal code emerging from the depths of the subconscious. Stress probably took its toll. She used some legal terms so boldly that Boris, under the furious pressure of the stranger, noticeably became shy, and then, carefully getting up, left the room, saying to his wife, "You're lucky that I have a strong head, otherwise I would have become a widow." When the man left, Helen sat down on the sofa next to Alien. The woman began to apologize to the guest. "Sorry, Helen, that this happened." Low inside the girl was still shaking with anger. She managed to answer almost calmly, "There's nothing to apologize for at all." Sophie, standing near the wall, listened to what was happening in the kitchen, where Boris had gone, and then she rushed there, surprising her mother and Helen. The man was busy climbing through the cabinets in a fit of rage. He threw everything out of them right onto the floor, quietly called out to her son-in-law, "Boris, calm down. I hid my stash a long time ago. As soon as I noticed that the bills began to gradually disappear from there, you won't find anything in the kitchen, don't hope." The man, not knowing where he was stepping, crushed cereals and pasta, left the kitchen, almost knocked down Sophie, who was in his way, and soon slammed the door loudly. And Sophie began to clean up the consequences of the destruction caused by Boris, and Helen, without thinking for long, joined them. In response to the hostess's objections, the girl admitted, "Partly I feel a little guilty for everything that happened, so of course I won't stand aside." The mess in the kitchen was almost eliminated when Boris appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a man in a police uniform. Hello. Boris invited me to look into the circumstances of the beating. Alien sank into a chair, exhausted. Sophie looked angrily at her husband, who, on the contrary, was jubilant. While the women were cleaning up, he made a fuss and literally dragged a law enforcement officer into the apartment, greatly exaggerating the scale of the conflict, naturally, without telling you that before the ill-fated blow to the back of the head, he almost sent his wife to the next world. Helen was amazed at Boris's impudence and blurted out to eliminate the possibility of a dirty trick from this man with a rotten and petty soul. "Excuse me, can I see your ID?" The lieutenant presented the documents and began the interview. While Elena began to talk about what happened, Helen asked permission to call. The policeman did not interfere, and the girl hurried to dial her father's number. Michael listened to his daughter without interrupting, and then said, "In general, Victor will call you back now. He is well versed in such matters. You put the phone on speakerphone, and I think he will be able to resolve this situation favorably and without unnecessary hassle." Helen's father was not mistaken. Boris's triumphant appearance melted as, during a telephone conversation, the policeman, seeing red prints on Sophie's neck, began to cast disapproving glances at the impudent man. The lawyer insisted that the lieutenant also accept a statement from the woman who had been attacked by her husband. And this speech had a wonderful effect. After the mutually amiable completion of telephone conversations, the man sternly asked Boris, "Are you still saying that your wife's mother hit you with a heavy bag for no reason at all?" The picture of this incident is completely different. You, Boris, practically made a false call and even lied. This case, unfortunately, is not subject to jurisdiction, but it is quite possible to run into a fine. Now I will write everything down as it happened and warn you right away. You don't need to deceive me anymore. When Alien showed her terrible remedy, which she applied to her son-in-law, the policeman could hardly contain his smile and involuntarily admired the large, elegant apples. Boris, having read and signed the document drawn up, showered curses and abuse on his wife, her mother, and their young intercessor who had come from nowhere. The district police officer reprimanded the man, and he left the apartment in a rage. The policeman, turning to Sophie, said, "I will advise you simply as a human being. Do not tolerate such an attitude. Further, as experience shows, similar marriages do not lead to anything good. It's not too late to get a divorce." Sophie thanked the district police officer. Thank you for your informal approach. We handled the situation fairly. Alien put almost half of the apples Helen had brought in a bag to the district police officer and handed it over with the words, "Please accept it as a token of gratitude. I am very embarrassed that my intemperance caused my son-in-law to disturb you." The district police officer shrugged his shoulders, saying that's the job. And then, as if having thrown off the plaque, he formally asked with admiration in his voice, "How did you manage to grow such beautiful apples? At my parents' dacha this year, almost the entire harvest was destroyed by hail at the ovary stage. What was not beaten rotted during the frost." Alien smiled. I myself didn't expect to admire such apples. This is a famous variety. The defender generously brought these apples to us from another region, where a seedling was delivered many years ago from a southern country by a very good person, despite the difference in climate. The tree has taken root. The police officer thanked him again for the apples, dictated his phone number just in case, and saying goodbye, left the apartment. Despite the successful solution to the problem, Boris's petty revenge in the form of calling the police turned out to be a rather exhausting event for everyone, Bale jokingly stating, "That's it, we've had enough cleaning for today. Where has this been seen? A girl came to visit us, and we gave her a broom and dustpan. That's it, girls, let's set the table in my room. With this hoard, we will be completely starved." Helen was removed from preparing for the feast, and she hurried to call her dad to report that the conversation with the lawyer had helped her get out of a very difficult situation. Michael and Anne, who knew a noticeably softened version of events from her husband, were relieved when their daughter reported this information. Still, even at 24 years old, Helen remained for her parents the same beloved little girl whom they wanted to protect, to cover with their care like a dome, impenetrable to all kinds of evil. As Alice said, Anna turned out to be an incredibly skilled craftswoman when it comes to food. Helen enjoyed trying the seemingly simple but extremely tasty bassifaye. After tea with delicious and homemade sweets, Sophie asked her guest, "Can we arrange a video conference on Skype with your dad? I would like to get to know my half-brother at least in this remote way." Helen admitted, "My parents also asked me about this, but I didn't know how to offer it. Is it convenient?" Alien threw out her hands. His daughter, "My clever girl, what a good idea you came up with. Come on quickly, set everything up." Just a few minutes later, an image of Michael appeared on the laptop screen. First of all, the man began to ask Alien for forgiveness. "It's difficult for me to talk about this, but the happiness of my parents' family and my, in fact, carefree childhood were actually built on the foundation of your misfortunes. Most likely, if letters from you had fallen into the hands of your father earlier, he would probably have found a way to help you. However, my mother was most likely afraid that he would give up everything and ask for a divorce. And he will go to you and his daughter, whom he never had the chance to meet. I sincerely apologize to you, Sophie. I want you to know that you can always count on me. Helen will leave you my phone number and other contacts. Contact us anytime you need it." Helen sat with the hospitable hostesses until the evening, listening and talking about herself and her family. Despite the rather strange circumstances of meeting, no one felt the slightest awkwardness. "I didn't even think that I would suddenly have such a wonderful niece." Alien, named Sophie for Helen, saw in her a subtle, almost imperceptible resemblance to George. Similar facial features, dimples, the funny habit of wrinkling your nose and frowning when you smile. For so many years, the woman remembered the only man she loved desperately, and then, as if out of habit, she hoped to meet. And now there is no more chance to see each other. It was incredibly sad, and there was only one consolation. George did not forget her and did not betray her. I naively believed what she said then. That's the only thing she could reproach him for, even if she wanted to. Countless times, Alien imagined that she had handled that fateful conversation differently. If only then, more than half a century ago, she had only found the courage to tell her beloved that her father was threatening to kill him if she had offered to run away. However, George would probably have found a more correct way to solve the problem. If only she had honestly told him everything many years ago. Most likely they would now be together as they dreamed. Maybe for Sophie, who would have felt the care and support of her father in her personal life, everything would have turned out much more successfully. Everything would have been much better. And she would not have gotten involved with this slippery, nasty Boris. They incredibly regretted that she was unable to protect her fragile love. But she couldn't blame the woman who became George's legal wife for this. In the end, it was she, even under pressure, who rejected her loved one. This means there is no point in looking for someone to blame on the side. The day turned out to be long, eventful, and after a hearty meal and long conversations, those sitting at the table began to yawn, either one by one or all at the same time. Helen flatly refused to be escorted to the hotel. "Don't worry, please. The taxi will take me directly to the place, so there will be no difficulties. As soon as I'm in my room, I'll let you know right away." Sophie said goodbye to Helen as a close relative, with whom they share not only blood ties but also friendship, before getting into taxi. The girl waved to her new acquaintances for a long time, looking out of the window, and did not notice how Boris, who was holding a grudge, was approaching her from a bench installed at the next entrance. The man believed that it was this strange young upstart, whom he saw today, for the first time in his life, who was to blame for the unsuccessful day. Just think, he grabbed it lightly, but it hurt her why she left the house and didn't even think to inform him. It is clear that the matter is unclean. He, as a husband, had every right to teach her how a decent woman should behave. And this little girl, instead of apologizing, began to argue with him, explaining that she had not done anything wrong, so he cut off her oxygen, a little to discourage her. And then, as luck would have it, the evil fury came at the wrong time and hit him on the head with all. Boris touched the back of his head, feeling a painful lump, and continued to think about the insult that he had to endure. Surely everything would not have turned out at all joyfully for the wife and her foolish mother, if not for an unfamiliar face. The devil dared her to end up in their apartment today. The man was sure that without the support of this educated trash, women would not have dared to blather in his direction. Moreover, he would have been able, most likely would have been able to convince the district police officer that the women were conspiring against him. But this young sheep turned out to have a trump card after the intervention of an obviously competent lawyer who knew all the laws. He, Boris, had to leave the apartment as a beggar, although he also has the right to square meters. However, the battle for them is still ahead. In the meantime, we need to deal with these insolent women. Of course, he's now breaking in on his wife and her mother. It's no use. They were probably locked with all the locks and a chain. But to lie in wait and teach a lesson, that would be right. It was for this reason that Boris sat on the bench, sort of like a predator in ambush, waiting for Sophie to see when the defenseless sheep leaves the herd and finds itself in his power. The man even laughed and was glad that he had found such a comparison. But the wait dragged on. The autumn evening, gentle and merciless, had already begun to hint that the planned hunt would not take place. Boris was trembling, either from suppressed rage or from hunger and cold, and was about to leave. But then the entrance door opened and a girl jumped out into the street. Boris's joy was somewhat premature because the impudent sheep climbed into the taxi. But this only provoked the man. The chase is the chase. Luckily, the cars are nearby. In the meantime, heavy traffic in the city will not allow the future victim to disappear from view. Helen had already grabbed the door handle to the hotel, dreaming of quickly collapsing on the bed and getting some sleep. But she heard a voice behind her. The girl automatically turned around and lost precious fractions of a second. Boris, whose voice she recognized very well, was rapidly approaching her. Helen turned away and, trying to quickly get into the hotel, out of fear began to push the doors in the wrong direction. When finally salvation was close, the man grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and began to threaten her in a falsely affectionate tone. "Where were you in such a hurry? Explain to me, why the hell are you interfering in my family life? Why are you silent, sheep? Who asked you to intervene?" The girl prepared to scream loudly and wondered how to free herself. But I didn't have to look for salvation on my own. She could not see how a district police officer, who was already in civilian clothes, appeared from the slightly open door behind her, but she was incredibly happy when she heard, "Boris, you are completely wrong now. Let the girl go." There were steely notes in the policeman's voice, and Boris instantly loosened his grip and made excuses to the district police officer. "I just came to talk." Then I thought of inviting him for a walk and showing him the city. The policeman, leaving the hotel, asked, "Helen, if you don't mind, wait for me in the foyer. I need to agree on something with Boris." Helen sat down in a comfortable chair. A few minutes later, a local police officer sat down next to him and admitted, "I actually came to see you. My parents immediately lost peace when they saw the apples. They asked me to come to an agreement with you about the cuttings. His father wants to vaccinate him and try to grow such beauty too." And I can't count how many times the markets have cheated with varieties. The picture shows one thing, but what emerges is something completely different. So I came here to the hotel, and as it turns out, it's not in vain. The girl smiled. She liked this young and somehow very correct and principled policeman. In gratitude for her salvation, she promised him to send as many Sherenkov as she wanted when she got to her grandfather 2 houses away. They exchanged contacts and said goodbye. The man did not want to part with the charming girl, but he could no longer find any reason to stay close to her. It seems that it was not in vain that Grandfather George sent me to look for Sophie in my dreams. He also advised me to take apples with me. Events after meeting the relatives began to develop with frightening speed. Sophie divorced Boris, and after exchanging the apartment, they moved at the invitation of Michael to his father's house. The man suggested from the bottom of his heart, "Since I am aware of my mother's guilt, let this house be at least a small compensation for all your suffering," and sat for a long time by the apple tree, carefully grown by his loved one, stroking it like a living creature. And Helen, who was always a welcome guest, was glad that the elderly woman, although belatedly, had found peace. In the personal life of the granddaughter, the glossy fruits of the airport also played an important role. Correspondence and regular telephone conversations with Sergio, that policeman, helped to find out that their sympathy is mutual and does not weaken over time, but even becomes stronger. Soon the lieutenant moved to the city to live with his girlfriend, explaining, "Well, our police required everywhere, and if necessary, I can master another profession." Sophie also found her personal happiness when she met a man in a new city. Anna, stroking the apple tree, quietly whispered, "Thank you, George. I know for sure that it was you who helped arrange everything so successfully."